The rolling sea was both a home and a prison to the pirates who lived upon it. Life aboard a pirate ship was a study in contrast, brutal, chaotic, and often violent, yet also strangely ordered and communal in its routines. Among the most critical and mundane of those routines was the daily act of eating. Though piracy conjures images of buried treasure and swashbuckling duels, for the men and women who sailed under the black flag, survival depended on salt meat, wormy biscuits, and whatever could be scavenged from the depths of the sea or stolen from unsuspecting merchant ships. The pirate's table, if it could even be called such, was rarely a place of comfort, but it was central to shipboard life. To understand pirate food is to understand the daily struggle, the hierarchy, and the sheer inventiveness that governed a life adrift. A pirate ship was not built with comfort in mind. These vessels were constructed for speed, stealth, and aggression. Storage space was limited, and the holdware food was kept competed with weaponry, stolen cargo, and spare sails. There were no refrigerators or pantries, only barrels sealed with tar, sacks hung from beams, and crates packed with salted meat or dried legumes. Pirates were often at sea for weeks without resupply, and the food they brought aboard had to last the journey. The ship's cook, if there was one, was usually not a trained culinary master, but rather an able-bodied seaman spared from more dangerous duties due to injury, age, or simple bad luck. His job was to make anything edible from the dwindling stores. Meals were typically taken on deck, weather permitting, and often in shifts depending on watch schedules. Pirates did not dine together in great halls with silver goblets and steaming roasts, as tales might suggest. Instead, they squatted near the galley firebox or ate while leaning against the rails, the sea spray mingling with every bite. Plates and utensils were rare. More commonly, food was served in communal pots, and sailors would use their knives or fingers to retrieve their portions. The egalitarian ideals of pirate crews, where loot was often divided equally, extended in some fashion to meals. Unlike naval ships, where officers dined separately and ate better, pirates typically shared the same rations, though the captain and quartermaster might take first pick from any fresh catch or stolen delicacy. The rhythm of eating was dictated not by appetite, but by availability and routine. Most pirates ate 2 meals a day, one near dawn, the other before nightfall. Breakfast was often simple hardtack softened in grog, a strip of dried meat, or leftovers from the previous evening. The main meal might include boiled peas or beans, salted pork or beef, and, if they were lucky, something freshly caught. Cooking was a dangerous affair. Open flames were discouraged aboard wooden ships, so meals were usually boiled over a small, controlled fire within a firebox lined with bricks and anchored near the galley. Frying or baking was nearly impossible, and most meals were stews or porridges to cook, easy to store, and capable of hiding less than fresh ingredients. It's tempting to imagine pirates as reckless hedonists, guzzling rum and devouring banquets nightly, but the truth was far more grounded in struggle. A successful raid might result in a sudden windfall of supplies, cheese from France, salted cod from Newfoundland, or even sacks of exotic spices from the East Indies. But such moments were rare and fleeting. The rest of the time, pirates made do with what they had. Hunger was a constant threat, especially during long voyages or failed pursuits. In such times, creativity and camaraderie became essential. Crewmates might pool their resources to share a last piece of cheese or ration grog with care, to keep spirits up. Food was not just sustenance. It was morale, power, and memory. The communal nature of eating fostered bonds among pirate crews. Mealtimes were often the only consistent moments of rest and socialization. Amid the laughter, grumbling, and occasional brawls, pirates forged connections, shared stories, and, perhaps, remembered a different life on land. For some, these moments brought a sense of home to a life otherwise adrift. Tales would be exchanged, a meal of roasted goat in a Jamaican port, the spicy stews of or the first bite of bread after weeks of hardtack. For many pirates, these memories were the most precious treasure they carried. The role of food extended even into pirate governance. Pirate crews often operated under written articles, democratic codes that outlined the rules of the ship. Among these were provisions for how supplies, including food and drink, would be managed. Stealing from the ship's stores was a serious offense, sometimes punishable by marooning or whipping. Fair distribution of food reinforced the sense of equality that set pirate life apart from naval hierarchy or merchant routine. Everyone ate together, suffered together, and celebrated together. But what about the realities of dining amid a storm, or the chaos of preparing a meal after battle? These moments revealed the improvisational genius of pirates. A ship tossed by waves might see a pot of stew sloshing from one side of the galley to the other, its contents mixed with seawater or soot. After battle, bloodied decks and injured men took priority. But once the smoke cleared, a hot meal, no matter how humble, became a bomb. Salt pork might be boiled with stale ale, or hardtack crushed into crumbs and fried into a crude pancake. These meals, born of necessity and desperation, became rites of survival. In setting the table at sea, pirates created more than just a routine. They carved out a rhythm in the lawless drift of their lives. Eating was never just eating. It was a reminder of their humanity, of their shared rebellion against the world that had cast them out. Each salted scrap and sip of grog was a quiet act of endurance. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the sea murmured below, the pirate ship became, in its own way, a floating homit's table, set not with silver and silk, but with grit, camaraderie, and the stubborn will to live one more day. When one imagines a pirate pantry, the vision that often springs to mind might include barrels of rum, wheels of cheese, and perhaps even hanging sausages swaying with the ship's motion. In truth, the pirate pantry was a far humbler and far more strategic affair. It was less a room and more a careful collection of stashes, barrels, and bundles spread across the hold and tucked into nooks aboard the ship. Stalking a pirate vessel was a task of both foresight and desperation, for out on the open sea, food was life and life was fragile. Understanding what pirates stocked, how they preserved it, and how they kept it edible gives us a deeper glimpse into the very heartbeat of piracy, survival through cunning. Provisioning a pirate ship began long before the sails were raised. When a crew planned a voyage, especially one of great length, they needed to carefully calculate how many mouths they were feeding and how long they'd be away from port. The quartermaster, often one of the most powerful and respected figures on board, oversaw the management of supplies. He was responsible not just for loot distribution, but also for ensuring the crew wouldn't starve before they found their next merchant prize or island haven. In this way, food became as vital to pirate operations as gunpowder and rope. The basic inventory of a pirate pantry included long-lasting staples that could endure heat, moisture, and time. Chief among them was hardtack, also known as ship's biscuit. This dry, unleavened bread was baked until it was rock hard and could last for years if kept dry. It was often stored in barrels or canvas sacks and was as tough to chew as it was reliable to keep. Pirates would often soak hardtack in grog or stew to soften it before eating, and even then, it sometimes harbored unwanted surprises, namely weevils. These tiny beetles would burrow into the biscuit over time, and sailors often had to knock their food against the table to dislodge them. Still, protein was protein, and the bugs were often consumed alongside the bread without much fuss. Salted meat was another cornerstone of the pirate diet. Pork and beef, packed in brine or dry salt, could be preserved for weeks or months, depending on storage conditions. The meat was often tough, overly salty, and unpleasant, but it delivered the necessary calories. These barrels were typically kept in the deepest, darkest parts of the ship's hold, where temperatures were slightly cooler. Salted meat might be boiled with dried peas or beans to make a kind of stew known colloquially among some sailors as loblolly or slush. The fat skimmed from the top was sometimes used as a cooking fat tour when times were especially lean, eaten on its own. In addition to hardtack and meat, pirates stocked dried legumes like peas and lentils. These could be rehydrated in water and added to stews, offering protein and fiber. They were also cheap and easy to store, making them ideal for long voyages. Oatmeal or cornmeal was also common, boiled into gruel or porridge and flavored if at all with molasses or a pinch of spices from stolen stores. Cheese was a rarer luxury. Only hard cheeses, like aged cheddar or Parmesan, could endure the ship's humid environment, and even these were prone to mold. Fresh fruits and vegetables were rare, and when they were available, they were eaten quickly before spoilage set in. Onions, garlic, and citrus were among the few produce items that had some shelf life at sea. Oranges and limes were prized not only for their taste, but for their ability to stave off scurvy, though this connection was not fully understood in the early days of piracy. Some captains, especially those with naval backgrounds, insisted on carrying citrus in their stores, even if only intermittently. Dried fruits, like raisins, currants, and prunes, occasionally appeared in the pantry, especially if taken from captured cargo. Pirates also stocked rice, particularly in voyages through the Indian Ocean or Southeast Asia. Unlike hardtack, rice required careful storage to avoid rot or infestation, but it was versatile and filled bellies. Flour was also kept in small quantities for thickening stews or making rudimentary flatbreads, though keeping it dry was a constant battle. Molasses, honey, and sometimes even sugar found their way into the pantry, typically as spoils of war. These sweeteners were highly valued and sometimes used in barter with local islanders or bribery with port officials. Storage methods were crucial to maintaining the quality of food. Barrels were the primary vessel for almost everything: meat, flour, pickled vegetables, and even water. These barrels were often reused, which could lead to contamination, especially if not cleaned properly. Canvas sacks, wooden crates, and hanging nets were used for items that needed ventilation or protection from moisture. Pirates had no refrigeration, and so cooling by depth placing the most perishable items in the lowest, darkest part of the hold was the only way to buy time against decay. One unique item often overlooked in discussions of the pirate pantry is vinegar. Not only was it used to pickle vegetables and preserve meats, but it also served hygienic purposes. Pirates would mix vinegar with water to clean utensils or rinse wounds, and it was sometimes used to scrub the decks to control odor and bacteria. Salt, meanwhile, was both a preservative and a seasoning. Whole sacks were dedicated to its storage, and though it was common, it was also vital. Food was not just loaded at the beginning of a journey. It was constantly resupplied through trading, bartering, or, more commonly, plundering. When pirates raided merchant ships, they were as keen on finding barrels of fresh water, bags of rice, and crates of preserved fish as they were on gold or silver. The freshness of these provisions made them more valuable than treasure, especially when far from any friendly port. Some pirate crews even spared enemy ships if they were well stocked with food, allowing them to live in exchange for their cargo. In these moments, the pantry was replenished in bursts, with exotic goods from far-off lands, cheese from Spain, wine from France, spices from India, briefly transforming the humble pirate pantry into a veritable banquet. Clever pirates also established friendly relations with local communities and outposts, where they could trade or restock. In the Caribbean, some crews developed semi-regular trade with indigenous peoples, escaped slaves, or sympathetic settlers, bartering weapons or trinkets for fresh food. Tropical fruits, coconuts, yams, and game were sometimes exchanged for tools, salt, or cloth. These informal relationships provided crucial supplements to the diet and often meant the difference between sustenance and starvation. Though rare, some pirate ships even carried livestock on shorter voyages. Chickens, goats, or pigs might be kept in cages and used as a source of fresh eggs, milk, or meat. These animals were loud, messy, and hard to manage, but they offered a mobile source of nutrition. On longer journeys, these creatures were usually slaughtered early to preserve meat before spoilage. In particularly dire times, rats, gulls, or even the ship's pets might be eaten, though. Such acts were usually signs of desperation and despair. Interestingly, the line between food and medicine was blurry in pirate culture. Some herbs and ingredients, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, were believed to have medicinal properties. A stew might serve to calm a stomach as much as fill it. When injury struck, pirates turned to their stores for comfort. Broth for the wounded, honey for infected wounds, grog to dull pain. These practical uses gave even the humblest food item a weight of significance beyond flavor or satiety. Finally, it's worth noting how the diversity of pirate crews influenced their pantries. Pirate ships often housed men from across the world, escaped slaves from West Africa, sailors from Britain and France, fishermen from the Caribbean, and even former naval officers. Each brought knowledge of different ingredients and cooking techniques, and when provisions allowed, meals were flavored with these cultural touches. The result was a rough but rich cuisine, one where African stews might be made with stolen Spanish pork, or English hardtack dipped into Caribbean molasses. In sum, the pirate pantry was no fixed larder, but a dynamic, ever-changing collection of whatever could be scrounged, stored, stolen, or traded. It was a system defined not by luxury, but by ingenuity. Every barrel and sack told a story of a merchant sloop ambushed under the cover of night, of a friendly exchange on a sun-drenched island, or of a desperate meal in the face of starvation. To open a pirate pantry was to open a map not of places, but of experiences, risks, and the relentless drive to survive one more day at sea. Of all the unassuming but legendary elements of life at sea, few are as emblematic or as infamous as the ship's biscuit, also called hardtack, sea biscuit, or even molar breakers. These rugged squares of baked flour were as essential to pirate life as cutlasses and cannonballs, though bland and seemingly unappetizing. These humble biscuits were a lifeline for sailors adrift in a world where food had to endure weeks or months without spoiling. Yet, while ship's biscuit was a marvel of preservation, it was also a curse to the palate and the teeth. In this chapter, we'll explore how it was made, why it was hated, and what life was like when your daily bread could double as a blunt weapon. To understand the ship's biscuit, you must first imagine the culinary priorities of a life spent far from land. The overriding need was shelf life. Pirates couldn't afford fresh bread, which would mold and crumble within days at sea. What they needed was something tough, durable, and resistant to moisture and decay. Ship's biscuit answered that call. Made from nothing more than flour and water, no yeast, no fat, no salt, it was baked several times to remove all traces of moisture. The result was a rock-hard puck that could outlast the voyage, the ship, and even the sailor who packed it. Some biscuits have been recovered centuries later, still intact and still, in theory, edible. The production of hardtack was an industry unto itself in many port cities. In England, bakeries near the naval docks mass-produced these biscuits by the barrel. They were rolled, stamped, baked once, allowed to cool, then baked again, sometimes a third time to ensure their longevity. Their square or round shapes often bore identifying stamps from naval contractors or port authorities. But pirates, of course, sourced their biscuits differently. Some were stolen from merchant vessels. Others were purchased or traded for in port or supplied by sympathizers. Still others were leftover military stores, sold second-hand or smuggled from shipyards. Pirates rarely had the luxury of fresh supplies, and so the ship's biscuit was often months or even years old by the time it landed in a pirate's hand. These biscuits could be dry, cracked, or flecked with mold, but far worse were the weevils. Flour beetles and their larvae thrived in the sacks of grain and flour stored aboard ships. Once baked into biscuits, the eggs often lay dormant, only to hatch once warmth and moisture were reintroduced. A pirate opening a biscuit might find a powdery interior teeming with tiny white worms or adult beetles scuttling across the crust. Though revolting, this was not unusual, and many sailors took it in stride. There were a few tricks for dealing with infested biscuits. One common method was to knock the biscuit against a hard surface to dislodge the bugs. Another was to dunk the biscuit in grogram, diluted with water, to soften it and cause the insects to float to the surface. Some pirates would break the biscuit into pieces and shake them in a cloth, hoping to filter out the worst of the infestation. But, in many cases, the weevils were simply eaten. They were, after all, a source of protein. Among pirates, this act wasn't seen as barbaric. It was just another part of surviving at sea. The taste of ship's biscuit, even when fresh and bug-free, left much to be desired. It was dry, flavorless, and took great effort to chew. Stories abound of sailors cracking teeth on the hardened bread, or of using it as a makeshift plate before finally softening it enough to consume. Despite this, the biscuit's endurance made it a dietary staple. Its blandness also made it adaptable. Pirates would crumble it into stews, fry it in lard if available, or mash it with molasses to create a crude dessert. In moments of relative abundance, it might be soaked in broth and mixed with salted meat forming a kind of thick porridge that filled the stomach and masked the texture. Meals built around hardtack were often repetitive, but they were also reliable. A stew of peas, onions, and salted pork could stretch further when bulked up with crumbled biscuit. In lean times, a single biscuit might be shared among multiple crew members, each dunking their portion in tea or grog. The biscuit was a canvas, sometimes for a decent stew, other times for desperation. The presence of the ship's biscuit on board also became symbolic. It was the first sign that the crew was setting off on a long voyage. Barrels were loaded and marked, and a few test biscuits would be handed out to ensure the batch hadn't gone completely bad. On especially long journeys, the last of the hardtack was often hoarded and rationed with care. Some pirates would mark their biscuits with notches, counting days or carving initials into them, a morbid reminder of time passed at sea. Pirates weren't the only ones eating hardtack, of course. The British Royal Navy depended on it, and so did merchant, mariners, privateers, whalers, and explorers. But the pirate relationship to the biscuit was unique because it was so dependent on improvisation. Pirates didn't have naval supply chains or official contracts. Their biscuits were whatever they could get tanned. They often got them under duress. After capturing a ship, one of the first things they'd do was inspect the food stores. Barrels of biscuit were among the most valuable non-monetary loot, and a pirate crew might weigh the quality of the provisions before deciding the fate of a captured vessel. Despite its notorious texture and flavor, there were rare moments when hardtack became the centerpiece of a pirate feast. On holidays such as Christmas, or after a major raid, pirates might combine all their available ingredients to create a kind of communal stew. The biscuit, mashed and boiled, would thicken the broth. Salt meat would provide the protein. Dried peas and onions added flavor. A splash of rum or molasses transformed it into something almost celebratory. For one brief evening, the ship's biscuit became something more. A shared dish, a hot meal, a memory of better times. Hardtack also had unexpected uses beyond the plate. In some cases, it served as a form of barter with coastal villagers or port officials. Its long shelf life made it a desirable item, especially in areas with limited access to flour or bread. It could also be ground down into flour and reused in cooking, though this required time and effort. Some pirates even used biscuit barrels to store other goods once the food was gone, given that the barrels themselves were sturdy and watertight. The cultural lore around the ship's biscuit grew with time. Some pirates developed nicknames for the food: sheet iron, worm cake, or navy bread. Songs and rhymes mocked its toughness. One popular chant went, "Hard as hearts of greedy kings. Break your teeth and crack your rings. Soak it deep in pirate's brew. Then hold your nose and chew, 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 chew." This gallows humor helped to make the daily grind of eating hardtack more bearable. It turned suffering into camaraderie, shared among crewmates who laughed as they cursed each bite. In rare cases, pirates turned their culinary skills toward crafting better biscuits themselves. On land, while docked or marooned, some attempted to bake their own, using flour taken from storehouses and simple brick ovens built on the beach. Pirates might prepare a fresh batch of hardtack for the journey ahead. These homemade biscuits were no tastier than the ones bought or stolen, but there was pride in their creation. To make your own food, even a simple one, was to reclaim a bit of agency in a world ruled by by scarcity. As pirate mythology grew in later centuries, the ship's biscuit became an object of fascination. In popular fiction, it was romanticized as part of the rough-and-tumble life at sea, another badge of honor for the seafarer who braved every hardship. In truth, it was just one more testament to the resilience of those who lived on the edge. It was not pleasant, it was not elegant, but it worked, and in the end, that was enough. The ship's biscuit reminds us that piracy was not all treasures and taverns. It was hunger, cold, and the daily grind of staying alive in a hostile world. In the cracking of a biscuit and the quiet chewing of a weary sailor, there was something deeply human, a need to endure and to make the most of whatever fate had placed in your hands. In the vast, drifting world of the pirate ship, meat was not just food, it was fuel, power, and at times, a rare taste of luxury. The ocean might surround them with seemingly endless bounty, but in truth, pirates often faced serious challenges in securing consistent sources of protein. Salted beef and pork, the bedrock of most maritime diets, were standard fare aboard these ships. Yet beyond these staples lay a world of improvisation, scavenging, and occasional ingenuity. Whether it was in the form of salted slabs, sea turtles dragged aboard in tropical waters, or unfortunate birds speared from the sky, meat on a pirate ship was never just about sustenance. It was about surviving with strength. The most common meats found on pirate ships were salted beef and salted pork. These dense, heavily cured cuts were preserved in large wooden barrels, often packed with salt or brined in an overpowering solution of salt water and spices when available. Their flavor was robust, overwhelmingly so, but, more importantly, the salting process kept the meat from rotting in the sweltering, humid conditions below deck. Salted meat could last for weeks if the barrels remained sealed and kept away from moisture intrusion. However, once exposed to air, the meat deteriorated quickly. Spoilage, mold, and infestation were common. Pirates, like all mariners of their time, had to develop a stomach of iron. The process of preparing salted meat for consumption was a ritual unto itself. It was rarely eaten raw from the barrel. Its salt content alone could burn the mouth. Typically, the cook or a designated crew member would soak the meat in water for hours or even overnight, changing the liquid several times to leach out the salt. This process didn't always work perfectly. Often, the result was still far too salty to enjoy. After soaking, the meat was boiled, and the resulting broth, greasy, thick, and briny, might be used as a base for a stew made from hardtack beans or dried vegetables. In some cases, a lucky crew might add onions or spices looted from a captured merchant ship, but most of the time, flavor was secondary to nourishment. Despite its unappealing texture and taste, salted meat was essential. It provided a dense source of calories and protein, helping pirates maintain the physical endurance required for their demanding lives. Whether manning sails, rowing boats, or engaging in hand-to-hand combat, a pirate's work was punishing. Malnutrition weakened the crew, and so even the worst cuts were eaten, bones, gristle, and all. Some pirates gnawed through ribs like dogs, stripping them clean and tossing them overboard as the ship pitched and rolled beneath their feet. Occasionally, fortune would shine brighter on a crew. When sailing through the tropical waters of the Caribbean or along the coasts of Central and South America, pirates had opportunities to catch fresh meat from the land or sea. One of the most prized targets was the sea turtle. These massive, slow-moving creatures often rested on beaches to lay eggs or floated near the surface of the ocean. Crews would send small boats ashore or harpoon turtles from the ship's side. The meat was tender, flavorful, and unlike the salted beef, freshably fresh. A large green sea turtle could feed a crew of 30 or more. Its meat could be roasted, boiled, or turned into soup. The fat rendered from the turtle's shell was used for cooking, and the shell itself might even be saved as a souvenir or sold in port. Another welcome addition to the pirate table came from the oceans themselves. Fishing was a constant side activity during calm stretches of sea. Lines, nets, and spears were all used to haul in fish, ranging from small sardines to large tuna or snapper. Some pirates even fashioned makeshift traps using crates or barrels, weighted with stones and baited with offal. Fish could be cleaned and cooked immediately, dried for later, or even pickled in vinegar or brine if the crew had the tools. Sharks were occasionally caught and eaten, though their meat required careful preparation to avoid strong ammonia flavors. Sailors believed shark meat to be both invigorating and dangerous a dish for bold men. Birds, too, were hunted when land was nearby. Seabirds, such as gulls or boobies, while not especially appetizing, were caught and cooked when nothing else was available. In tropical regions, parrots and other exotic fowl were captured and caged not just as pets but as future meals. Some pirates took to raising chickens aboard ship, keeping small flocks in coops near the galley. The birds provided a steady supply of eggs and could be slaughtered when the need arose. However, the noise and mess often led crews to abandon such efforts after only a short while. On rare occasions, pirates encountered ships carrying livestock as cargo. Cows, goats, and pigs were precious prizes. Upon capturing such a ship, the animals were either slaughtered on the spot or transported carefully and noisily back to the pirate vessel. The resulting feast was memorable. Pirates roasted pork over open flame when possible, or stewed beef with wine if any was found aboard the prize ship. Goat meat was considered tough but flavorful, and any animal not immediately eaten might be kept for a few days, provided the crew could spare the water and feed. Such occasions transformed the ship from a floating war machine into a banquet hall of raucous celebration. Yet, despite these brief moments of richness, meat was often a source of distress and decay. Rotten meat was a serious problem, especially in the tropics. Even salted meat could go bad if the barrels were compromised by heat, sea spray, or careless storage. The stench was overpowering. Pirates who opened a tainted barrel might retch from the smell alone. Mold, maggots, and slime coated the meat. In desperate times, even these horrid scraps were eaten. Boiling could kill bacteria, and spices or grog might mask the worst of the flavor. But the health consequences were real. Diarrhea, vomiting, and even death could result from consuming spoiled meat. Still, starvation was worse. There are recorded instances of pirates facing meat shortages so severe that they turned to extreme measures. Stories tell of leather belts being boiled to create a gelatinous stew. Old shoes, soaked and scraped, were chewed to stave off hunger. In the worst cases, marooned men or shipwreck survivors were rumored to have turned to cannibalism. These tales were told in hushed tones, grim reminders of the line between man and beast. Whether such acts were truly committed or merely exaggerated by sailors' imaginations, they underscored the desperation that hunger brought upon the sea. Interestingly, some pirate crews developed etiquette around meat, especially during lean times. Portions were often distributed by the quartermaster, who ensured fairness among the crew. Captains did not hoard the best cuts, and disputes over food could lead to serious consequences. Pirate codes often included clauses about food rationing and theft. Stealing meat from the ship's stores could result in flogging or worse. The integrity of the pantry was sacred. It was what stood between the crew and the abyss. In port, pirates indulged in the meats they missed most. Roasted lamb, spiced beef, sausages, and stews became the centerpiece of tavern feasts. Land provided not only taste, but texture: meat with crisped edges, meat with fat that sizzled and cracked. For many pirates, these meals were the most memorable part of their journeys. They represented a return to civilization, even if temporary. And when the ship sailed again, barrels of salted meat were restocked, new livestock loaded, and memories of sizzling meat were tucked away for cold nights at sea. Meat, then, was both a blessing and a burden. It carried risks of spoilage, of disease, of conflict, but it was also essential for survival. In every chew of sinew and every boil of brine-licked pork, pirates reaffirmed their defiance. They ate not with refinement, but with purpose. They tore into meals not for enjoyment alone, but because they needed strength to hoist sails, swing swords, and chase down prey. The meat on the high seas was not merely nourishment. It was the heartbeat of a life lived on the edge, where every bite mattered. In the storied world of pirates, few images are more iconic than the swaying figure of a sea rover clutching a mug of rum, slurring sea shanties under the moonlight. Alcohol, particularly rum, has become so deeply associated with piracy in the popular imagination that it's difficult to picture a pirate ship without barrels of it sloshing in the hold. But while the romanticized image holds a grain of truth, the real drinking culture aboard pirate ships was far more complex, more practical, and often more desperate than legend suggests. Rum was indeed central to pirate life, but so too were grog, beer, water, and the constant struggle to stay hydrated in a world where most fresh supplies spoiled faster than the wind could shift. Let us begin with the most practical of liquids: water. Fresh water was, paradoxically, the rarest and most precious drink aboard any ship. Unlike meat or hardtack, which could be preserved through salting and drying, water turned foul quickly. Stored in wooden barrels that were prone to leakage, bacterial growth, and infestation, water could sour in a matter of days. The heat of the sun and the rocking of the ship hastened the process. Pirates who drank unclean water risked dysentery, typhoid, or worse. Despite its necessity, it was often approached with caution and diluted whenever possible. This led to the rise of grog, a drink as ubiquitous to the pirate life as the cutlass. Grog was, in essence, a survival drink, a mixture of water and rum, sometimes spiked with citrus or spices, designed to make putrid water drinkable and provide a measure of fortitude. The British Royal Navy is credited with formalizing grog in the 18th century, but pirates and seafarers had long been diluting strong spirits to stretch their supply and sanitize their hydration. The typical grog mixture varied by ship and circumstance. Some added sugar, nutmeg, or lime juice. Others simply mixed water and rum in equal parts. It was not designed for flavor, but function. It kept spirits high, morale stable, and some believed disease at bay. Rum itself has a fascinating origin, closely tied to the world pirates inhabited. Distilled from molasses, a byproduct of sugarcane refining, Rum was a product of the Caribbean plantation economy. In the early 17th century, enslaved Africans and laborers on European-controlled sugar plantations in Barbados, Jamaica, and Hispaniola began fermenting molasses into a crude, potent drink. Over time, this rough spirit was distilled into what became known as rum. Its popularity soared among colonists, traders, and, of course, pirates. Rum was cheap, strong, and widely available in the West Indies, where pirate ships frequently made landfall. It became the drink of choice not just because of its taste, but because it was plentiful, portable, and profitable. Pirates acquired rum in various ways. Sometimes it was purchased at ports or taverns with plundered gold. More often, it was stolen, seized in raids against merchant ships or colonial outposts. Entire cargoes of sugar and rum were common targets. Barrels of the liquor were hauled onto the ship and added to the communal stores. On long voyages, captains or quartermasters were tasked with rationing it, ensuring that the crew didn't consume it all in a single celebratory binge. A single barrel might be stretched over weeks if diluted properly and distributed in small daily portions. But moderation was not always practiced. Indeed, rum was often at the center of pirate revelry, both at sea and ashore. After a successful raid or a particularly long stint without conflict, the crew might hold a feast or celebration. Rum flowed freely, sometimes spiked with exotic spices or fruit juice from recently plundered ships. These were moments of pure release. Songs were sung, games played, and grievances aired. For some pirates, the opportunity to drink without restriction was one of the few pleasures in an otherwise brutal life. The decks would echo with laughter, toasts, and shouts of "Drink up, me hearties," as men let the tension of life at sea melt away in the embrace of drunken camaraderie. But there was a darker side to this indulgence. Alcohol-related discipline problems were common. Pirates, though known for their democratic structures, often had strict codes regarding behavior, especially during battle or periods of high alert. Drinking on duty was forbidden on many ships. A pirate too drunk to fight or navigate posed a serious threat to the entire crew. Mutinies, fights, and fatal accidents could stem from unchecked consumption. While most crews tolerated heavy drinking after hours, a balance had to be struck. Some captains, like the infamous Black Bart Roberts, strictly limited alcohol to maintain order and readiness. Others, like Blackbeard, leaned into their drunken reputations, using rum-fueled chaos as both weapon and persona. Beyond rum and grog, pirates also drank beer and wine when they could get it. Beer was less common due to its shorter shelf life, but it was occasionally loaded aboard in casks from northern ports or looted from ships. It was especially prized in the early days of a voyage, when it was still fresh and cool. Wine, on the other hand, appeared more frequently, especially from ships trading with Spain or Portugal. Barrels of red or white wine, even sherry or port, might be consumed quickly during celebrations or stored away for special occasions. The wine was sometimes mixed with water as well, or used in cooking to tenderize tough, salted meats. Spirits from other parts of the world also found their way into pirate hands. Aguardiente, a fiery liquor from Spanish colonies, was popular in Central and South America. Arrack, a distilled drink made from rice, sugar, or fruit in the East Indies, occasionally appeared among Indian Ocean pirates. These drinks varied in strength and flavor, but all served the same purpose: to invigorate, to numb, or to mark moments of significance. Even brandy and gin were sometimes carried, though these were considered higher-class fare, more common on merchant or naval vessels than in the holds of outlaw ships. Occasionally, pirates drank for reasons beyond pleasure or necessity. Alcohol was used in medical treatments. Wounds were washed with it. Toothaches were dulled with a swig. Grog was prescribed for fever and rum for shock. In the absence of formal medicine, alcohol became a kind of cure-all. But while it might disinfect a cut or numb pain, it could not cure disease. In fact, excessive alcohol often weakened the immune system, leaving pirates vulnerable to infection and scurvy. Some tried to counteract this with citrus added to their drinks, a practice that, unknowingly, did help in preventing scurvy. Limes and oranges were rare luxuries, but when they were added to grog or rum, they did more than improve flavor. They extended life. Of course, not every pirate drank heavily. Some abstained for religious reasons or because of personal trauma. A few pirate captains enforced dry ships, particularly in dangerous waters, where discipline was paramount. Others used alcohol as a reward or punishment, granting access to the rum barrel for good behavior or denying it after a fight. It was, in some ways, a currencia tool of control and cohesion. And despite its many drawbacks, the presence of alcohol often provided emotional relief in a world that offered few comforts. Taverns, on the other hand, were where the pirate relationship with alcohol reached its most fevered pitch. When ashore, pirates often spent their shares of plunder on massive drinking binges. Caribbean ports, like Port Royal, Tortuga, and Nassau, became infamous for their alehouses, brothels, and rum shops. Tales abound of pirates who drank themselves into stupors, woke up penniless, or engaged in barroom brawls that left whole neighborhoods wrecked. The scenes were chaotic, colorful, and sometimes tragic, but they were also moments of freedom where pirates, many of whom had been abused or enslaved in their previous lives, could taste autonomy. Drink, then, was not just a pleasure or an escape. It was a statement. It marked the pirate as free from naval hierarchy, free from royal control, free from the oppressive chains of sobriety and civility that governed the world they had rejected. To raise a mug of rum was to raise a middle finger to the empire, to toast to a life carved out of lawlessness and lived with both joy and defiance. And yet, for all its cultural weight, alcohol could never fully fill the void. It numbed pain, but it did not erase loss. It dulled fear, but it could not prevent death. In the quiet of the night, after the laughter faded and the bottles lay empty, many pirates stared into the dark with the knowledge that tomorrow might bring cannonballs, disease, or drowning. For them, drink was both shield and sword protection against despair, and weapon against the grim reality of life at sea. So drink up, me hearties. For on the high seas, each sip was more than a moment of indulgence. It was an act of survival, of rebellion, of fleeting peace in a world that rarely allowed it. To sail beneath a pirate flag in the early modern world meant more than simply pledging loyalty to a rogue crew. It meant becoming a citizen of the sea, crossing borders and oceans, confronting different landscapes, and crucially adapting to different food cultures. Pirates, after all, were opportunists. Their bellies didn't distinguish between oceans. They ate what the world offered, and few waters offered more variety than the Caribbean and the Mediterranean. These two regions, so distinct in climate, culture, and resources, presented dramatically different challenges and opportunities when it came to pirate cuisine. To understand what pirates ate is to understand where they sailed. The Caribbean and the Mediterranean each shaped pirate diets in ways that went far beyond salt pork and weevil-filled biscuits. Let us begin with the Caribbean, often regarded as the golden stage for pirate legend. Its azure waters, lush islands, and scattered colonies made it not just a haven for pirate hideouts, but a veritable buffet for those who knew how to take advantage. The Caribbean climate was tropical and humid, which brought challenges for food preservation, but also blessings in the form of bountiful plant life and marine resources. Islands like Hispaniola, Jamaica, and Cuba were rich in fruit-bearing trees, fresh springs, wild pigs, and fishing grounds. Fruits were among the Caribbean's greatest gifts. Pirates who came ashore might find mangoes, guavas, coconuts, bananas, papayas, and citrus fruits hanging from branches or growing wild near settlements. These fruits provided not only flavor and variety, but critical nutrients, particularly vitamin C. Scurvy, the sailors' dreaded disease, was often kept at bay during time spent in the Caribbean. Pirates came to prize limes and oranges, not only for their refreshing taste, but for their ability to preserve health. Coconuts, too, were a treasure. The water inside kept men hydrated, and the meat was filling and fatty. Some crews collected coconuts by the sackful and carried them aboard for days at sea. In addition to fruits, Caribbean islands offered root vegetables and tuberosiums, sweet potatoes, cassava that could be roasted over fire or boiled into stews. These crops, often cultivated by enslaved African communities or indigenous peoples, made their way into pirate cuisine by way of trade, plunder, or mutual cooperation. Cassava, when properly prepared, could be dried into flour or pounded into cakes. Pirates would sometimes grind it with dried fish to create a kind of meal that kept for days. Then there was the sea itself. The Caribbean waters teemed with fish, snapper, grouper, mahi-mahi, barracuda, and more. Pirates cast lines from deck or launched small skiffs to fish closer to shore. With time and skill, a crew could bring in dozens of fish in a day. Turtles, as mentioned in earlier chapters, were a delicacy and a staple. In certain seasons, turtle nesting grounds became prime targets. A single female turtle, weighing hundreds of pounds, might provide meat for an entire crew. The fat could be rendered, and the shell kept as a trophy or tool. But food in the Caribbean wasn't only forage. It was often taken. Many Caribbean islands were home to Spanish, English, French, or Dutch colonial settlements. While some pirates plundered these towns for gold or ships, others did so simply for provisions. Storehouses might be raided for salted cod, flour, sugar, or barrels of molasses. Pirates developed a special taste for the sweet things. Sugarcane was chewed for energy, while molasses and rum became prized additions to meals. The latter, of course, also filled the rum barrels that played such an essential role in pirate culture. Some pirates, especially those with longer stays ashore, forged relationships with locals' escaped slaves, maroons, or sympathetic settlers who traded food, herbs, and knowledge of the land. Through these encounters, pirates learned Caribbean cooking methods, how to roast meat in pits, season stews with wild peppers, or wrap fish in banana leaves before grilling. Spices like allspice, cloves, and chili peppers added fire to otherwise bland pirate fare. The result was an increasingly Creole cuisine, a blend of European staples, African ingenuity, and indigenous techniques. Contrast this with the Mediterranean, where piracy had an even older legacy. Centuries before the golden age of piracy in the Caribbean, the Mediterranean was home to Barbary corsairs, Greek klefts, and Maltese privateers. Here, the climate was drier, the seas calmer, and the shores more densely populated. The food culture of the Mediterranean was ancient, rich, and heavily influenced by trade. Pirates operating in this region had different priorities and different flavors. Mediterranean pirates, especially those along the North African coast, lived near cities and towns where food was plentiful and markets brimming with variety. Coastal cities like Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli served as bases for corsairs and offered ample access to wheat, olives, figs, grapes, and almonds. Bread, often flat and baked in large communal ovens, replaced the hardtack of the Atlantic. Pirates here might eat flatbreads with olive oil, lentil soups, or dishes seasoned with saffron and cumin. The proximity to land made fresh food more available, though not necessarily more abundant during long stretches at sea. One of the cornerstones of the Mediterranean diet was olive oil, used for cooking and preserving. Pirates who raided Italian or Greek vessels might steal amphorae filled with oil, wine, or pickled goods. Unlike Caribbean pirates, whose cooking often involved fire pits and roasts, Mediterranean pirates might prepare meals using preserved vegetables, eggplant, peppers, tomatoes, along with grains like bulgur or couscous. Salted anchovies and sardines were common at sea, as were flat cheeses like feta or halloumi, which could be stored in brine. The availability of wine also set Mediterranean pirates apart. With vineyards stretching across southern Europe and North Africa, wine was far more common than rum. Pirates looted barrels of red or white wine, stored it in casks, or drank it fresh in port. Some crews even carried amphorae of vinegar to preserve vegetables or season food. Alcoholic indulgence still featured heavily in pirate culture, but it came in different forms. Wine and urok in the east, beer and brandy in the north, and the ubiquitous rum of the Atlantic, notably absinthe. Fishing remained vital, especially along the Aegean and Adriatic seas, where pirates could haul in octopus mussels or sardines. The Mediterranean diet was more varied in its protein options. Chicken and lamb were common in port meals, and salted or smoked meats like prosciutto or pastrama made their way onto pirate ships. Dried fruit like dates, figs, and raisins were also stored aboard, not just for sustenance, but for energy during battles or rowing. In many ways, Mediterranean pirate fare was more refined, reflecting the depth of civilization along those coasts. Still, life at sea in the Mediterranean had its own deprivations. Pirates operating far from their home ports, particularly those attacking Spanish or Venetian ships, often spent long stretches in uninhabited islands or hiding in rocky coves. Their food dwindled just as quickly as in the Caribbean. In such times, even the most luxurious diet gave way to the barest minimum: dried bread, salted fish, lentil soup, or nothing at all. Some relied on sea urchins, wild herbs, or roasted snails gathered from rocky shorelines. Others turned to barter or bribes, trading stolen goods for sacks of flour or goats from frightened villagers. Interestingly, the cultural and religious composition of Mediterranean crews affected what they ate. Many Barbary pirates were Muslim and avoided pork. Others were Orthodox Christians, Jews, or Catholics, each with their own dietary laws. On some ships, food was divided not just by rank, but by faith. Crews might prepare meals separately or avoid certain ingredients altogether. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, pirate crews were often more religiously indifferent. Food was food, and anything that filled the belly was fair game. In comparing these two regions, we see not just differences in ingredients, but in attitude and access. Caribbean pirates were often cut off from civilization for long stretches. Their meals reflected improvisation, theft, and survival in isolation. Mediterranean pirates, closer to land and the comforts of coastal towns, integrated more elements of regional cuisine into their diets. They ate from markets, not just barrels. They drank wine beneath the cliffs of Corsica and spiced their food with saffron bought in Alexandria. Caribbean pirates, by contrast, lived more frequently on what they could grow, catch, or take. Yet, in both cases, pirate food tells the story of adaptation. These men and women sailed where others feared, and they ate what others overlooked. Their bellies knew many languages. Their pots held the flavors of Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas. They boiled root vegetables in Spanish molasses. They salted fish with Tunisian spices. They feasted on stolen cheese from Sicily one week and drank fermented coconut water off the coast of Trinidad the next. Ultimately, the difference between eating in the Caribbean and the Mediterranean was not simply about what was eaten but how it was found. The pirate's plate was a mirror of the world, full of conflict, trade, migration, and survival. And whether it held cassava and rum or olives and lamb, it was always seasoned with the salt of the sea and the hunger of men who lived outside the law. For pirates, as for all seafarers of the early modern age, food was not merely a resource, it was a lifeline. Yet unlike naval fleets or well-financed merchant ships, pirates sailed without the backing of empires or access to reliable supply chains. Their sustenance depended on what they could plunder, trade, or forage, and when those means failed, the results were dire. This chapter examines one of the most harrowing aspects of life at sea. What happened when food ran out? It is a story not just of hunger, but of desperation, invention, fear, and, sometimes, moral collapse. Hunger crept in slowly. At first, it was only the absence of variety, a string of days, eating nothing but hardtack and salted pork. The cook would ration supplies more strictly, thinning stews, breaking biscuits into smaller pieces, and reusing the briny meat water as a kind of soup stock. But the men noticed. Grumbling would begin. Jokes would be made at first about chewing on old boots or catching seagulls, but everyone felt it. Stomachs growled in the middle of the night, and eyes grew sharp and quiet when food was mentioned. Hunger wore down morale as surely as cannon fire wore down a hull. Pirate ships were, at their core, floating contradictions. They were chaotic and violent, yet governed by democratic articles. They rejected the empires they preyed upon, yet often mimicked their structures. Food shortages tested these contradictions. When stores dwindled, crews were forced to confront not only their hunger, but their values. Would they share what was left equally? Would those in power hoard supplies? Would someone steal from the hold, risking punishment or, worse? Pirate codes often included specific rules about food, how it should be divided, who got what, and what to do when it began to run out. The fairness of this system was a point of pride. But when hunger set in, the pressure fractured that ideal. The first to vanish were the fresh items, citrus, coconuts, anything perishable. Then the salted meats, the flour, the dried peas. Barrels of water turned green with algae. The biscuits, infested with weevils, became the last palatable item. Eventually, even those would disappear. At that point, the crew faced true deprivation. The ship's carpenter might be asked to dismantle parts of the vessel to retrieve crumbs of grain stored deep in the hold. The cook might try boiling ropes or leather belts, hoping to soften the fibers into something chewable. Tales abound of pirates boiling candles or mixing sawdust with molasses to form a kind of paste. None of it satisfied. Rationing became an agonizing ordeal. A slice of hardtack per day, a spoonful of water. Some ships implemented formal schedules. Each man received a fixed portion at dawn and dusk, nothing more. Guards might be posted at the supply barrels. Theft was punished severely, not just out of anger, but because a single stolen meal could mean another man's death. And yet, theft happened. Hunger was stronger than fear. Men snuck into the hold in the dead of night, slipping their hands into barrels in search of forgotten crumbs. Some were caught and whipped. Others simply vanished, pushed overboard, or locked in the brig by furious crewmates. Violence was common in these situations. A crew on the verge of starvation became volatile. Petty insults turned into brawls. Paranoia spread. Men accused each other of hoarding, of hiding food in their hammocks or beneath their clothing. Fights broke out over portions, over rumors, over nothing at all. The captain's authority might weaken, the quartermaster's fairness called into questions. Mutiny loomed not over gold or strategy, but over food. There are recorded instances of entire crews turning on their officers for failing to lead them to safe harbors or food-rich targets. In such moments, hunger became a political force, destabilizing the delicate balance of pirate life. Some crews attempted to supplement their dwindling stores through foraging or fishing. When weather allowed, nets were dropped and lines cast. Men leaned over the rails with harpoons, hoping to strike fish or turtle. Seabirds, lured by the scent of the ship, might be caught with nets or slings. But bad weather, still seas, or poor luck meant such efforts often failed. Some pirates turned to desperate measures, boiling the leather from belts or shoes, eating rats, gnawing on ropes soaked in grease. Anything organic became a potential meal. Candle wax, made from animal fat, was sometimes melted and mixed with biscuit dust into a crude form of porridge. It had no nutritional value, but gave the illusion of fullness. Shipwrecks and maroonings presented an even more extreme version of this nightmare. Pirates, stranded on remote islands or wrecked upon reefs, had nothing but the clothes on their backs and what the sea could offer. Marooning, once a common punishment among pirates for mutiny or theft, became a sentence of slow starvation. Victims were typically left with a pistol, a flask of water, and sometimes a small amount of food. Their survival depended on their environment. Some managed to catch fish, crack coconuts, or hunt small animals. Others died within days. The story of Alexander Selkirk, marooned for 4 years on an uninhabited island, would inspire the novel Robinson Crusoe. But for every survivor like Selkirk, dozens more succumbed to thirst, exposure, and hunger. Perhaps the darkest consequence of food shortages was the threater reality of cannibalism. Rare, reviled, and almost always shrouded in secrecy, cannibalism was the ultimate taboo. But in the most desperate of situations, especially during shipwrecks or after prolonged starvation, some crews resorted to it. The choice was never taken lightly. First, animals were consumed: rats, birds, dogs, even shipboard monkeys, then leather and rope. Then, if the hunger continued and the dead outnumbered the living, some began to consider the unthinkable. There are accounts from across maritime history of the custom of the sea, a grim ritual where lots were drawn to determine who would be sacrificed so that the others might survive. While more frequently documented in naval or merchant tragedies, there are whispers that pirate crews, too, engaged in this practice during extreme crises. These stories are rarely confirmed, often passed through third-hand reports or sailors' tales whispered in portside taverns. But their persistence suggests a chilling truth that even among the lawless, there were moments so desperate that the laws of nature superseded the laws of men. Yet, amid the horror, there were also moments of ingenuity. Pirates were nothing if not adaptable. Some learned to ferment seawater and bird droppings into a crude broth that could provide minimal hydration. Others used scraps of sailcloth soaked in fish oil to extract sustenance. When nearing land, men would climb into the rigging with spyglasses, searching for palm trees, smoke, or signs of settlement. In the face of starvation, every mind turned inventive. Hunger became the mother of all invention. Eventually, salvation came more. It didn't. Some ships found land, resupplied, and survived. Others encountered merchant vessels, either by luck or predation, and seized food by force. A successful raid during a famine was cause for immense celebration. The plunder might be modest barrels of biscuits, crates of onions, sacks of flour, but the value was incalculable. After days or weeks of hunger, even the simplest meal tasted like a royal banquet. Pirates would dance, sing, and feast, not because they were gluttonous, but because they had stared into the abyss and returned. The emotional toll of starvation lingered. Men who had gone hungry never forgot it. Some became hoarders, hiding food in secret compartments. Others grew violent at the mere suggestion of rationing. The trauma of near starvation left psychological scars. It became a story told in hushed tones. Remember the voyage off Barbados, the rats we boiled, the time Jones stole the biscuit and lost his hand. Hunger shaped pirate culture, not just physically, but spiritually. It was a shared fear, a ghost on every voyage. In the broader context of pirate history, food shortages remind us that these men and women were not merely romantic rebels. They were human beings navigating a brutal, indifferent world. Their lives were fragile. Their freedom came with risk. When food ran out, all the treasures in the world meant nothing. Only the next meal mattered. And so, pirates hunted not just for gold, but for bread, for life. They sailed not just for fortune, but to fill their stomachs and survive one more day on a merciless sea. When one envisions a pirate ship slicing across the horizon, sails billowing and black flag flying, the last image that likely comes to mind is that of a man hunched over a steaming cauldron, carefully stirring a bubbling stew. Yet behind the battles, the treasure, and the legendary bravado, daily life on a pirate vessel had a rhythm, and at the heart of that rhythm was food, and at the heart of food was the pirate cook, a figure both indispensable and often overlooked. The pirate chef was a craftsman, improviser, healer, and, in many ways, the morale officer of the ship. His tools were few, his pantry limited, and his galley ever shifting with the sea. But from these humble constraints, he crafted the lifeblood of the crew. Unlike naval vessels, which had trained cooks and provisions provided by a supply chain, pirate ships rarely had the luxury of professionalism. The pirate cook was usually chosen from among the crew not for culinary expertise, but because he was injured older, or simply less suited to combat or climbing rigging. A peg leg, missing hand, or poor eyesight might relegate a man to the galley, where he could still serve the crew without endangering operations. But that did not mean the cook was unimportant. In fact, his role was critical. A good cook could make spoiled rations palatable, stretch meals farther than expected, and lift the spirits of a crew teetering on despair. A bad cook could ignite mutiny. The galley, or the ship's kitchen, was often little more than a small space near the stern or amidships, depending on the vessel's layout. Fire aboard a wooden ship was one of the greatest dangers imaginable, so cooking had to be conducted with extreme caution. Most galleys featured a brick or metal-lined firebox, known as a caboose or camboose. This structure housed a small fire, often fueled by charcoal or dried wood, and allowed the cook to boil, stew, or occasionally fry small portions of food. The firebox was either built directly into the ship or secured in a large iron tray to prevent tipping. When seas were calm, cooking was relatively safe, though still laborious. In storms or high winds, it was often abandoned entirely for fear of setting the ship ablaze. The cook's tools were as basic as his ingredients. Large iron cauldrons, often blackened by years of use, served as the primary cooking vessels. These pots were suspended over the flame or nestled directly into coals. The cook might also have a few knives, a wooden spoon, a ladle, and perhaps a cleaver for butchering fresh catch. A wooden cutting board, if available, was a prized possession. Straining cloth, skewers, and ladles made from coconut shells or carved wood were improvised as needed. Cooking utensils were rarely washed with fresh water due to its scarcity, and saltwater rinses were the norm, adding yet another briny layer to every dish. Storage of ingredients was another challenge. Food was kept in barrels, sacks, crates, and sealed pots, all tucked into every available nook of the hold. The cook had to remember what was stored where, what was still edible, and how best to rotate stock before it spoiled. Spoiled food meant sickness, and sickness aboard ship could sweep through a crew with terrifying speed. The cook was often among the first to smell the telltale signs of rot sour meat, moldy bread, or fermenting beans. He made judgment calls daily. Is this meat still good? Will a double boil render it edible? Can we mask the mold with vinegar or spices? In many ways, the pirate cook was the ship's first line of public health defense. Despite the limitations, meals were prepared with care. Pirates generally ate twice a day, once in the morning and once in the late afternoon. The morning meal might be a simple grulla thin porridge made from cornmeal, oats, or flour, mixed with water or watered-down grog. If any dried fruit or molasses was available, it might be added for flavor. The main meal of the day was often a stew or broth, prepared from whatever the cook had on hand: salted meat, dried peas or beans, biscuit crumbs, onions, and spices looted from merchant ships. When fresh fish or turtle meat was available, the pot became a celebration. The stew might simmer for hours, thickening as the cook added biscuit dust or cassava flour to stretch it further. Though meat was scarce and often salted beyond recognition, the cook developed techniques to make it edible. Soaking it overnight, boiling it multiple times, and seasoning it with vinegar, citrus, or rum were common practices. Pirates knew well the art of disguise, making rotten meat taste acceptable, masking smells with onions or garlic, or frying offal with fat and molasses to create something vaguely appetizing. Meals were never served on plates. Instead, pirates ate from communal bowls or directly from the cooking pot, using their hands, knives, or pieces of hardtack used like spoons. Occasionally, the cook would experiment with flour, water, and a hot surface. He could fashion flatbreads or bannock-stance cakes that could be eaten hot or stored for later. If sugar or fruit was available, he might attempt a crude pudding by mixing ingredients in a cloth bag and boiling it for hours. These moments of creativity were cherished by the crew. They broke the monotony and reminded everyone that life could still hold small pleasures. A cook who could surprise his mates with something sweet or spicy earned immense respect. But the cook's duties extended beyond feeding the crew. He was also a healer, often working in tandem with the ship's carpenter or surgeon. He brewed herbal teas, boiled onion poultices, and prepared soothing broths for the ill. Spices like ginger, cloves, and cinnamon were used to treat indigestion, seasickness, or infections. Garlic, long believed to have antiseptic properties, was added to food not just for flavor, but for health. When men were wounded in battle, the cook might prepare soft meals or feed them by hand. In his own way, he cared for the crew as much as the doctor did. His position was not always secure, however. A cook who made the crew sick, burned the stew, or spoiled a precious batch of meat could find himself cast out. Some pirate codes protected the cook from punishment, recognizing the difficulty of his job, but others made no such allowances. There are stories of cooks being flogged, demoted, or even marooned for repeated failures. On one notorious ship, a cook who served moldy biscuit soup was tied to the mainmast and pelted with the same biscuits he had boiled. Whether apocryphal or not, the tale underscores how seriously pirates took their food. In port, the cook's duties shifted. He might venture ashore to procure supplies, barter with locals, or inspect goods offered by traders. He selected meat, examined sacks of flour for weevils, and ensured the quality of salt, spices, and oil. Sometimes he collaborated with tavern cooks, exchanging ideas or learning new recipes. In places like Tortuga, Port Royal, or Nassau, pirate cooks gained reputations, both good and bad. A skilled cook might even be traded between ships or invited to join new crews based on his ability to turn hardtack and salt beef into something bearable. Cooking aboard ship also required adaptation to the weather. Calm seas meant steady heat and consistent cooking. Storms meant chaos. Fireboxes were extinguished, pots tied down, and meals served cold. In high winds, even lighting the stove was dangerous. The cook often had to prepare food in advance or find safe pockets of time between squalls. Boiling a pot of stew in a rocking galley required balance, strength, and endurance. There are accounts of cooks tying themselves to the stove or wedging their feet between barrels to stay upright as they stirred. Many bore burns, scars, or missing fingers testaments to the hazards of their trade. Though rarely celebrated in song or legend, the pirate cook was the quiet backbone of the crew. His tools were soot-stained and worn, his hands calloused, his clothes perpetually stained with grease and smoke. Yet, to the starving pirate who had just survived a storm, a bowl of warm stew or a piece of fried dough was as valuable as any doubloon. In many ways, the galley was the heart of the ship, not the captain's quarters or the gun deck, but the small, smoky space where hunger met ingenuity. They shared meals, jokes, stories, and silences. They gathered around the cauldron, not just for food, but for comfort. And though the cook rarely held a sword or fired a musket, he fought his own battle every day against the sea, the rot, and the relentless gnawing of hunger. In the popular imagination, pirates seized treasure chests brimming with gold, jewels, and silver goblets, booty fit for a king. But to the men and women who lived day to day aboard the creaking decks of a pirate ship, treasure came in many forms, and often the most cherished prize wasn't a bar of Spanish gold, but a barrel of fresh water, a wheel of cheese, or a sack of flour free of weevils. Food, in the world of pirates, was not just sustenance, it was survival. And during raids, food was taken, measured, and hoarded with as much excitement and urgency as any precious gem. In this chapter, we explore the essential but often overlooked reality of piracy, that food was loot, and sometimes the most valuable kind. A pirate crew could go weeks or even months without seeing land. During such long voyages, food stores inevitably diminished, often faster than expected due to spoilage, theft, or simple miscalculation. So, when a pirate ship spotted a potential target, whether a plotting merchantman heavy with colonial goods or a naval tender resupplying an outpost, the question wasn't always what treasure lies within, but what are they carrying to eat? The last might include barrels of salted meat, crates of citrus fruit, sacks of flour or beans, cheeses wrapped in wax or cloth, and even alcohol, rum, wine, or brandy. These supplies were not simply luxuries. They were the difference between health and scurvy, morale and mutiny, life and death. The quartermaster or cook inspected the bounty, assessed spoilage risk, and incorporated the new goods into the ship's stores. Fresh food was consumed. Quickly ripe fruit and soft cheeses wouldn't last long in the heat of the tropics or the damp Mediterranean. Salted and dried goods were repacked and stored deep in the hold. Alcohol was decanted into smaller barrels for rationing. The arrival of new provisions often meant a celebratory meal, and the ship would briefly transform into a place of revelry and relief. These were eaten almost immediately, sometimes even before the rest of the plunder was tallied. Similarly, fresh fruit, especially citrus, was devoured to stave off scurvy. Oranges, lemons, and limes were medical gold. Pirates, who understood the effects of vitamin C, even without knowing the science, would go to great lengths to secure such items. Cheese, too, was a prized commodity. While most cheeses spoiled quickly, harder varieties, such as Parmesan, aged cheddar, or Dutch Edam could last for weeks if stored properly. These cheeses were not only filling, but calorie-dense, compact, and satisfying. They also offered a break from the monotony of salted meat and hardtack. A few slices of cheese with biscuit and a mug of grog could feel like a royal feast on the high seas. The Caribbean was rich with sugar plantations, and many trade ships carried massive quantities of raw sugar, refined sugar loaves, and the thick, dark byproduct known as molasses. Pirates used sugar in cooking whenever possible to sweeten gruel, mask the taste of spoiled meat, or mix with alcohol. Molasses, in particular, was incredibly versatile. It could be stirred into porridge, fermented into a crude liquor, or smeared on dry biscuit to make it more palatable. It also provided much-needed calories, essential for long voyages and heavy labor. Spices and condiments, though not as necessary for survival, were considered high-value loot for their rarity and ability to transform basic meals. Nutmeg, cinnamon, cloves, pepper, and mustard seeds could make a stew taste entirely new. Pirates who captured spice ships from the East Indies or merchant vessels from India or the Levant sometimes found sacks of cardamom, star anise, or saffron, though these were often sold at port for profit. A clever cook might pocket a handful to enhance meals for the crew. The morale boost from a spiced meal could be considerable. In a world of monotony and hardship, even a hint of flavor was a godsend. Alcohol, particularly rum and wine, was a form of loot that served many purposes. It could be traded, consumed, or stored. Pirates rationed alcohol carefully, understanding both its importance to morale and the dangers of overindulgence. When pirates captured ships carrying fine winers, particularly Madeira, port, or sherry, they celebrated. But they also understood the value of restraint. A few barrels of strong spirits could be more valuable in trade than in drink, especially in port towns where alcohol was taxed or restricted. Some captains allowed celebratory binges after particularly hard-won battles, but many restricted alcohol until the ship reached safety. It is worth noting that food plunder sometimes saved entire voyages. There are recorded cases where pirates, low on rations and facing starvation, stumbled upon merchant ships with holds full of grain, salted fish, or barrels of water. In these cases, the food was not just looted, was salvation. One famous account tells of a pirate crew off the coast of Hispaniola that had gone 2 weeks with no fresh provisions. When they captured a French sloop carrying onions, oranges, and smoked hams, they wept openly while eating. The hams were devoured in hours, the oranges carefully divided and rationed, the onions used in every meal for the next week. The crew later referred to that ship not as a prize, but as a miracle. In some cases, pirates prioritized food over treasure. If the captured ship was poor in silver, but rich in fresh produce or livestock, they might spare the crew and take only the provisions. There are accounts of pirates trading goods back to their victims in exchange for flour, eggs, or live chickens. These interactions defy the brutal stereotype and reveal a deeper logic. Treasure could wait, but hunger could not. Food was the foundation of survival. Without it, no crew could continue their campaign. Plunder could build fortunes, but provisions kept them alive to spend it. Livestock was another valuable capture. Ships transporting goats, pigs, or chickens were sometimes raided specifically for these animals. Pirates would bring them aboard noisy, messy, and all hoping to fatten them for later meals. The animals were penned in small cages near the galley or lashed to the deck. Fresh meat was a rarity, and a fattened pig meant fresh pork, lard for frying, and bones for broth. Eggs from hens could be eaten or used in cooking, and goats could be milked for a time, though difficult to maintain. Livestock offered something no salted barrel could: freshness. While food was rarely sold like traditional treasure, it did hold value in informal economies. Pirates who made landfall in remote islands or friendly ports often bartered stolen food with locals. A wheel of Dutch cheese, a jug of wine, or a crate of flour might be exchanged for repairs, tools, fresh water, or information. Some pirates developed relationships with shoreside contacts fishermen, plantation workers, or colonial smugglers who would trade foodstuffs for protection or luxury goods. These networks helped pirates operate outside formal markets and extended their autonomy. Medical supplies, too, were looted alongside food. Many ships carried herbs, dried fruit, vinegar, and spirits for medicinal purposes. Pirates who seized these stores ensured their wounded had a better chance of survival. Lemons and limes were as valuable for preventing scurvy as they were for flavoring grog. Vinegar served both as a disinfectant and as a way to pickle vegetables or soften old meat. Dried mint, ginger, or cinnamon might be steeped in water to settle upset stomachs or treat colds. In this way, food and medicine often overlapped. Some pirate captains became known for their efficiency in targeting provision ships. Rather than chase Spanish galleons bristling with cannons, they pursued lightly defended supply vessels carrying food to colonial outposts. These ships were easier to capture, and their cargo, though less glamorous, was often more practical. A single shipment of grain or salted cod could keep a pirate flotilla active for weeks. The best captains understood this. They pursued not just wealth, but longevity. Ultimately, food as loot reveals the raw logic of piracy. To live free of empire, one must be clever, adaptable, and always prepared for want. In the grand theater of pirate life, a barrel of biscuit could mean more than a chest of coin. The finest meals often came not from taverns or markets, but from the bellies of captured ships. And so, as cannon smoke cleared and boarding lines fell slack, pirates didn't always rush to the captain's cabin. Often, they hurried below deck to the pantry, the storeroom, the cargo hold, searching not for treasure, but for their next meal. There are few moments in the life of a pirate as charged with tension as a mutiny when discipline shatters, power shifts, and the fragile unity of a ship dissolves into chaos. Likewise, few punishments carried as much dread as marooning, the practice of abandoning a crew member on an isolated island, often with only the barest supplies, left to the mercy of the elements. In both situations, food played a pivotal role, not just as a source of sustenance, but as a symbol of loyalty, betrayal, power, and punishment. This chapter explores how meals were shaped, shared, weaponized, and withheld during mutiny and marooning. In these moments of crisis, food became more than nourishment. It became a language of survival and a measure of human worth. On most pirate ships, life was governed by a mutual code, a set of rules agreed upon by the crew. This code often included stipulations about food rationing, sharing, and theft. It dictated who received what, how meals were divided, and what punishments would be dealt for hoarding or tampering with provisions. In stable times, this system worked well. Pirates prided themselves on their relative egalitarianism. Unlike naval ships, where officers feasted while common sailors starved, pirate crews usually ate together, often from the same pot. But when tensions mounted, when food ran low, when plunder was meager, or when the captain's authority waned, the very act of eating became political. Mutinies rarely erupted overnight. They simmered, and food, or the lack thereof, was often one of the first signs. Complaints about smaller rations, accusations of favoritism in the galley, or whispers about the captain hiding better provisions for himself. These were all early rumblings of unrest. A crew forced to subsist on maggoty hardtack, while their officers dined on cured ham and cheese from a recent raid, would grow bitter quickly. A cook seen slipping an extra portion to the quartermaster, while others went hungry, might become a target of resentment. Meals were not just fuel, they were statements of who mattered. In such moments, the galley became a site of subtle rebellion. A cook loyal to the mutineers might begin withholding food from the captain's allies or over-seasoning meals to make them inedible. Poisoning, while rare and difficult to carry out at sea, was a whispered threat. More often, food was used as leverage. Access to the galley, the ration barrels, or the water casks became a tactical objective in any coup. The mutineers might seize the stores first, effectively starving their opposition into surrender. A crew that controlled the food controlled the future. When mutiny broke out in full, food distribution changed overnight. Power shifted, and with it, the contents of every bowl. Those who had been hungry might now feast. Those who had been favored might now starve. In some cases, the cook himself became a new kind of officer, elevated for his ability to keep the crew fed during the chaos. His allegiance became crucial. If he supported the rebellion, he could be protected. If he refused, he might be thrown overboard or worse, forced to cook for those who had deposed his captain. Some mutinies were bloodless, others ended in executions. But in their aftermath, the question of provisions always reemerged. Pirates could not feast indefinitely. Once the adrenaline faded, they faced the same old problem: how to stretch supplies, how to plan for the next raid, how to keep the crew satisfied without descending into further division. Meals became rituals again this time, with an added layer of fragility. Every bite was a reminder of what had been risked and what had been won. On the other end of the spectrum, from mutiny, stood marooning, one of the most feared punishments in pirate society. When a crew member violated the code, stealing, mutinying, cowardice, or insubordination, they could be left behind on an uninhabited island or desolate coast. The condemned might be given a pistol with a single shot, a flask of water, a small ration of food, and little else. It was a sentence of exile, often wrapped in a thin veil of mercy. Food, in this context, was not kindness. It was a time limit, a way of saying, you have 3 days to live unless you can make your own way. Accounts of marooned pirates reveal just how crucial food was to survival land, how deeply they feared its absence. Alexander Selkirk, the mariner whose experience partly inspired Robinson Crusoe, survived for 4 years on a deserted island in the South Pacific. Though not a pirate himself, his ordeal was mirrored by many in the golden age of piracy. Selkirk subsisted on goats, wild turnips, and shellfish, learned to dry meat and build shelters, and eventually tamed wild cats to protect his food from rats. His resourcefulness became legendary, but not all castaways were so lucky. Some pirates marooned on islands in the Caribbean or along the Gulf of Mexico managed to survive by fishing, climbing coconut palms, and hunting crabs or iguanas. A few were even rescued by passing ships or rejoined by their old crews after tempers cooled, but others perished from starvation or from dehydration when no fresh water could be found. Their bodies were sometimes discovered later, bleached by sun and salt, a grim warning to others. For those left behind, every scrap of food was sacred. A single coconut might be rationed over 3 days. A dead seabird roasted over driftwood might provide a week of calories. Even seaweed, soaked and chewed, became a lifeline. The symbolic power of food in marooning situations cannot be overstated. Sometimes the act of denying food was itself the punishment. There are accounts of pirates forced to watch their rations tossed into the sea before being left ashore. Others were given rotten or spoiled provisions, final insult from the crew that cast them out. The pistol, in these cases, became the only reliable companion. Food was denied, and so too was the future. Not all maroonings ended in death. Some pirates, hardened by their experiences, used the time to reflect, survive, and even re-emerge stronger. There are stories of marooned men who built rafts from driftwood, fashioned fishing spears from broken barrels, and found underground springs or rain catchments to survive. One legendary tale speaks of a pirate who was left with a musket, a hatchet, and a bag of lentils. He reportedly lived for months, growing vegetables, drying fish, and building a signal fire that eventually attracted the attention of a French trader. When he returned to the mainland, he refused to rejoin a pirate crew, but he sold his story to a tavern keeper who turned it into a popular ballad. In both Mutiny and Marooning, food became a central theme, a reflection of trust, betrayal, justice, and endurance. To eat well was to have power. To be denied food was to be erased. Meals served after mutiny were loaded with political meaning. Who received the first portion? Who served it? Whether it came from new stores or the old captain's private stash, even silence at meals spoke volumes. The former officer, forced to eat beside his one-time subordinate, felt the shift more keenly than any words could express. Sometimes food could also heal old wounds. After a mutiny, when the ship had calmed and a new captain appointed, the cook might prepare a celebratory stew or open a rare bottle of wine. These meals were symbolic acts of unity, proof that the crew had survived the storm. In Marooning, the reverse was true. Food marked the end of community, the final line between one of us and no longer ours. In this way, the kitchen and the cutlass were never far apart. Every revolution needed both, weapons to seize control and meals to cement it. Every exile began not with a pistol shot, but with the clink of a biscuit in a tin box and the splash of water in a flask. In pirate culture, where rules were mutable and life hung in the balance, food remained one of the few constants, a tether to humanity, even in moments of deepest conflict. Food, in these contexts, took on the weight of fate. It was not just sustenance, but a narrative, a marker of status, a tool of punishment, a beacon of hope. The cook's ladle could soothe a crew or stir its anger. A bowl of stew could unite a mutinous crew, or be the last warm thing a man tasted before the long silence of exile. In this floating world of shifting loyalties, harsh judgments, and fleeting brotherhood, the simple act of sharing or withholding a meal could change the course of lives. Before the roar of cannon fire, before the stormy sea and splintering masts, and long before any loot changed hands, every pirate voyage began with a far quieter but equally vital ritual. Provisioning the ship, feeding the crew before the voyage wasn't just a logistical necessity, was a test of leadership, a communal rite, and a moment of tense anticipation. It was here, in the bustle of ports, on the muddy docks behind Caribbean taverns or Mediterranean wharfs, that the future of the voyage was partly decided. Because, while treasure, tactics, and tides mattered, a pirate crew well-fed before departure stood a much better chance of surviving what lay ahead. To understand what feeding a crew involved, one must first appreciate the scale and urgency of the task. A pirate ship carried anywhere from 30 to over 150 men, depending on the size of the vessel and the ambition of its captain. Each man required food and water, ideally for weeks or even months at sea. This meant the crew needed thousands of pounds of rations, stored in a way that could survive heat, humidity, pests, and salt air. But pirates didn't have formal supply chains or government stores. They relied on what they could buy, barter, or steal. This made provisioning chaotic, creative, and often morally ambiguous. The process usually began with a council of officers, the captain, the quartermaster, and the cook, occasionally joined by the boatswain or the sailing master. These men debated the length of the journey, likely destinations, how much time would be spent away from friendly ports, and how many crewmen would be aboard. Based on this, they calculated quantities: so many barrels of hardtack, so many sides of salted pork, so many sacks of dried peas, beans, or rice. But math was only part of the equation. Local availability, weather, recent raids, and even rumors of famine or blockade affected what could be gathered. In Caribbean ports like Port Royal, Nassau, or Tortuga, food could be purchased if discreetly. Tavern keepers, smugglers, and colonial merchants often sold supplies on the sly, asking few questions in exchange for gold or favors. Pirates might send representatives ashore with coins clinking in their pockets, bargaining for flour, dried fruits, salted fish, and barrels of fresh water. Other times, they used fear as currency. Towns that relied on pirate trade knew better than to cross a ship's quartermaster. Not everything was bought. In ports with weaker defenses, pirates would sometimes raid storehouses or ambush supply carts bound for colonial garrisons. A well-organized provisioning raid could yield not just food, but weapons, powder, sails, and medical supplies. Such acts were risky to much violence, could close a port to future visits, but when time or funds were short. Piracy extended to provisioning as well. The most common food items stocked before departure were those that could endure long sea voyages. Hardtack, also known as ship's biscuit, was a cornerstone. These dry, durable crackers were baked until they could survive months in damp barrels. Pirates preferred to obtain freshly baked hardtack, though they often made do with old naval stores. Casks were filled to the brim, each biscuit layered carefully to reduce breakage. Alongside them came barrels of salted meat, mostly pork and beef, cured with coarse salt or brined in thick solutions to ward off spoilage. These were heavy, pungent, and vital. Dried legumes, peas, lentils, beans offered protein and bulk. Pirates packed sacks of these, knowing they could be boiled into stews or mashed into paste. Rice and cornmeal were also favored, especially among crews with African or Caribbean roots, where such grains formed the basis of familiar dishes. In warmer ports, pirates sought out cassava flour, used to make flatbreads or porridge, and often more palatable than wheat-based hardtack. Water and alcohol presented a unique challenge. Fresh water spoiled quickly when stored in wooden barrels, becoming slimy, green, or infested with insects. To counter this, pirates diluted water with rum, creating grog. They also carried beer and wine when available, knowing these lasted longer. Vinegar was sometimes added to water to preserve it, and also served double duty as a cleaning agent and medical rinse. For longer voyages, ships carried citrus juice, pickled limes, or even barrels of plantain vinegar, prized for staving off scurvy. Cheese, if obtainable, was often packed in wheels, wrapped in cloth or wax. Hard cheeses lasted longest. Pirates also stocked onions, garlic, and root vegetables like yams or turnips, which could survive weeks if kept cool and dry. These vegetables weren't just for meals, they helped treat ailments, ward off disease, and added essential flavor to otherwise bland stews. Fruit, though beloved, was less reliable. Pirates took what they could: bananas, coconuts, oranges, pineapples, and mangoes. But they understood these would rot quickly. Some captains limited fruit purchases to the last day before departure, storing them in the coolest part of the hold. The crew devoured them in the first days of the voyage, savoring sweetness before the monotony of biscuit and salt meat resumed. One overlooked aspect of pre-voyage provisioning was the ritual of the final meal ashore. Pirates were men who lived on the edge, and they knew any voyage could be their last. Before setting sail, crews often indulged in lavish feastsore, as lavish as their means allowed. In taverns and cookhouses, they spent their shares of past loot on roasted meats, baked breads, seafood, and alcohol. These gatherings were wild, chaotic, and deeply emotional. Friendships were forged, debts repaid, grudges forgotten or renewed. Meals stretched long into the night, filled with singing, shouting, and toasts to fortune and revenge. Cooks often used these moments to gather supplies on the sly. Tavern kitchens might be liberated of extra flour, knives, or dried herbs. Friendly innkeepers might slip the cook bottles of vinegar or sacks of salt in exchange for a cut of future loot. The last night ashore was both celebration and scavenging. Pirates knew how fleeting comfort could be. The following morning, the ship came alive with activity. Provisions were loaded, aboard with speed and care. Barrels were rolled up planks and secured in the hold. Sacks of grain were lifted with pulleys and stashed in hammocks to keep them off damp floors. The cook oversaw every step, shouting orders, directing placement, and marking which barrels held what. Some captains inspected the supplies personally, tasting the biscuit, sniffing the meat, or inspecting the water for cloudiness. Every item mattered. Once the ship left port, there was no turning back. Before departure, the cook would often prepare a farewell meal, a stew made from the freshest meat, a batch of biscuit fried in fat, or even a pudding if eggs and flour were abundant. This meal was part morale booster, part statement. We begin well. For superstitious sailors, the taste of that meal was an omen. If it was good, the voyage would be too. If it was spoiled or bland, some feared the journey would end in disaster. There were also superstitions surrounding food and sailing. Some crews refused to bring bananas aboard, believing them to bring bad luck. Others insisted on carrying a piece of stale bread from the last voyage, a charm against hunger. Salt was never spilled without immediate atonement. And more than one crew refused to depart until the cook had fed every manavan, if only a sip of broth or a chunk of bread. Hunger at departure was seen as a curse. Once underway, the crew settled into the rhythm of sea life, but the memory of that first provisioning day lingered. The crew judged the captain and quartermaster not just on discipline and battle prowess, but on how well they had stocked the ship. A voyage that began with full bellies and decent food stood a far better chance of maintaining morale during the weeks ahead. Hunger frayed tempers, poor meals soured moods, but good food, well chosen, well packed, and well prepared, was the glue that held the crew together through storms, battles, and sleepless nights. Feeding the crew before the voyage was more than practical. It was symbolic. It meant readiness. It meant someone had cared enough to think ahead. It meant the ship sailed, not just in search of gold, but with the hope of returning. And in a world where the line between life and death could be drawn by a single bad wind or rotten barrel, that hope mattered. At first glance, the meals aboard a pirate ship might seem to be all about function. Fill the belly, keep the crew alive, stave off scurvy and starvation. But to stop there would be to miss the deeper currents that flowed through the food culture of pirates. Beyond the salt pork and biscuit lay something more profound, something psychological. because eating, especially in the harsh, uncertain world of a pirate's life, was never just eating. It was an act of comfort, a display of control, a ritual of belonging, and at times, a desperate grasp for normalcy amid chaos. In this chapter, we examine the inner world behind each bite, the psychology of pirate eating. Life at sea was unrelenting. The daily grind of sailing, repairing sails, maintaining weapons, standing watch, and facing storms wore down even the hardiest of men. Pirates lived without safety nets. Their lives were precarious, vulnerable to injury, betrayal, and the ever-present threat of naval retaliation. In such a brutal and uncertain world, food offered more than calories. It offered structure. The act of preparing and consuming meals at regular times imposed a rhythm on the day. Amid the disarray of the open sea, with no landmarks, no ticking clocks, and no sunrise alarms, breakfast and supper became anchors in time. A bowl of stew wasn't just a bowl of stew, was reassurance that the ship was intact. The stores hadn't spoiled, and the crew could fight another day. This simple repetition grounded men in the present and helped stave off the existential weariness that so often accompanied long voyages. Then there was comfort. In a world that routinely offered suffering and pain, food was often the only sensual pleasure a pirate could count on. The taste of warm porridge after a cold, wet night watch, the sharp sweetness of citrus after weeks of blandness, the occasional luxury of cheese or fried dough, these moments were treasured. They reminded pirates of land, of homes left behind, of family kitchens, taverns, and markets. The act of eating was often an act of remembering a quiet, personal moment amid the noise of cannon fire and sea shanties. Shared meals also created solidarity. Pirates came from vastly different backgrounds: escaped slaves, former sailors, ex-soldiers, convicts, and adventurers. They spoke different languages, followed different religions, and bore different wounds. But when they squatted in a circle on deck and passed around a pot of stew or dipped biscuit into grog, those differences blurred. The meal became a common denominator, a moment of equal standing. They ate the same food, suffered the same shortages, and shared the same hunger. In that sense, food was a tool of democracy. But the shared table also revealed the subtle power structures aboard the ship. Even among pirates who prided themselves on equality, rank had its privileges. The captain and quartermaster often received their food first. The cook might set aside the choicest bits of meat or an extra slice of bread for favored crew members, though most pirate articles mandated equal shares of plunder and provisions. Subtle inequalities crept in, and food became a way to assert or contest status. This created a complex emotional landscape around food. A pirate denied his share or, suspecting he received less, might feel humiliated, angry, or paranoid. Food could sow tension. In times of abundance, the galley was a place of laughter. A stingy quartermaster might be challenged. A cook accused of favoritism could find himself the subject of whisper campaigns, or worse. Yet food could also heal wounds. After a fight, a storm, or a particularly bloody raid, the act of sharing a hot meal brought the crew back together. Even simple meals had emotional weight. A stew prepared with care, a biscuit flavored with molasses, or a pot of fish soup caught fresh from the sea could restore morale. These gestures were remembered. They became stories retold in quiet moments. Remember that stew we had off Barbados? Best we ever ate? Food became part of the crew's collective memory, and identity. Psychologically, the cook occupied a unique role. He was not just a laborer, but a kind of emotional mediator. The cook sensed moods, gauged tension, and adjusted meals accordingly. When spirits were low, he might prepare a special dish if supplies allowed. When conflict simmered, he might ensure fair portions, reinforce equality. He was part therapist, part magician, conjuring meaning from onions and salt pork. In a world with no shrinks or chaplains, the cook's pot was a vessel of calm. Scarcity, of course, transformed the psychology of eating entirely. When rations ran low, every bite became magnified. Pirates learned to chew slowly, savoring hardtack as if it were cake. They hoarded crumbs, licked bowls clean, and invented elaborate rituals around their portions. Some carved their initials into biscuit to prevent theft. Others devised games of luck to decide who got the last slice of cheese. These behaviors weren't childish, they were psychological responses to trauma, ways of asserting control in a world spinning out of it. The psychology of scarcity also triggered strange transformations in value. A rotten onion, once an afterthought, became a prized possession. A spoonful of sugar, previously dumped without thought, was now hoarded like treasure. Pirates developed an acute sensitivity to food quality. They noticed if a stew had fewer beans than usual. They whispered if one man's biscuit looked larger. This hypersensitivity to fairness, particularly around food, reflected not just hunger, but the importance of shared hardship in pirate society. Injustice, real or perceived, could fracture a crew. Then there were the rituals and superstitions. Pirates believed in omens, and meals were fertile ground for them. A burned stew on the morning of a voyage. Bad luck. A seagull stealing biscuit from a sailor's hand, a sign of death. The last orange rolling off the deck into the sea, misfortune ahead. These beliefs gave pirates a sense of narrative order, a way to make sense of chaos. Meals became moments to read the signs, to test fate, to make small offerings of gratitude or plea. Pirates also used food in psychological warfare, not just against each other, but against the world. Raiding a merchant ship and seizing its food stores was more than theft, it was domination. To sit on the deck and roast the enemy's ham, to drink their wine, to toss their bread to the seagulls. This was a statement. We have taken what you need to live, and we feast upon it while you beg. Food was a trophy as much as treasure, a symbol of conquest, and a way to erase class hierarchies. Pirates, many of whom came from poor or enslaved backgrounds, turned the tables literally on the elites who once fed at their expense. Food also carried emotional weight. Many pirates had fled homes, families, and past lives. A particular dicey pudding, like their mother used to make, a roasted fish, like they once ate by the docksgood, stirred deep feelings. Tears were not unheard of around the stew-pot. Laughter too often burst forth during meals, especially after hardship. Sharing stories, singing, teasing, and even impersonating officers or rival captains all took place over meals. These interactions were vital. They humanized the crew, reminded them of their own mortality and community. Even death could not sever the link between pirates and their food. When a crewmate died, some ships held a funeral meal in his honor. His portion would be divided, sometimes thrown to the sea as an offering, or placed on an empty plate at the next meal. These acts helped the crew grieve. They gave structure to loss and offered a moment of silence, of memory, in lives that often left little time for mourning. Food also reflected the values of pirate society. Waste was frowned upon, sharing was respected, greed was punished. Meals were communal, egalitarian, and practical. They embodied the pirate code: fairness, independence, and mutual reliance. And when those meals were good, when the cook worked a miracle, when the fish were biting, when a ship was taken and the hold full of cheese and wine, then eating was ecstasy. Pirates didn't just eat to live. They lived to eat, at least in those fleeting moments when the world seemed generous. In the end, the psychology of pirate eating is a story of resilience and humanity. These were not wild savages, but people navigating a world of harsh choices. Food was how they coped, how they bonded, how they remembered, how they resisted despair. A biscuit, a bowl of stew, a jug of grogvies were their tools of emotional survival. They laughed with them, cried with them, dreamed with them. And through these simple, shared meals, pirates carved out moments of peace on an ocean that rarely offered any. Pirates lived lives cloaked in myth, but behind every legend was a very real human being with a stomach to fill and cravings to satisfy. Though popular imagination often paints them as cutthroat brutes, swilling rum and devouring hunks of meat like wild beasts, the truth is far more nuanced and, in many cases, more fascinating. Pirates had preferences, rituals, superstitions, and, yes, favorites. In this chapter, we cast our net across the seas of history and gather what we can about the favorite foods and eating habits of famous pirates, the meals they savored, the rations they rejected, and the culinary marks they left on maritime folklore. Let us begin with one of the most infamous names in pirate lore, Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. Towering, fearsome, and theatrically menacing, Blackbeard struck terror into his enemies by weaving slow-burning fuses into his beard and igniting them during battle. But while he crafted an image of ferocity, Blackbeard was known to enjoy certain luxuries aboard his ship, Queen Anne's Revenge. Reports from captured crew and witnesses noted that Blackbeard favored hot stews, rich with spices, when available. He liked his meals hearty and preferred a mix of salt pork, dried beans, and onions stewed together. In a raid off the Carolina coast, his crew reportedly found barrels of vinegar, molasses, and mustard seed, which Blackbeard allowed the cook to use liberally. There is even mention of pickled herring being present aboard his ship, an unusual item for a pirate vessel, possibly plundered from a European merchantman. Blackbeard was also a notorious lover of drink, but contrary to the common image of him constantly drunk, there is evidence he rationed alcohol carefully among his crew. He appreciated the combination of strong spirits with spices, and it's believed he sometimes drank his rum mixed with ginger and citrus juice, both for flavor and to keep illness at bay. Whether by superstition or strategy, Blackbeard seemed to understand that a crew fed well was a crew that fought well, in his own appetite for flavorful, spiced food hinted at a palate more refined than one might expect. Next, we turn to Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two of the most iconic women to sail under the Black Flag. Operating primarily in the Caribbean, they served aboard the crew of Calico Jack Rackham. Bonny and Read were known for their fierce tempers, deadly swordplay, and refusal to be treated differently than their male counterparts. Unfortunately, direct documentation of their dietary habits is sparse, but we can make educated inferences based on their circumstances and recorded anecdotes. The Caribbean climate and proximity to rich ecosystems meant that their crews often supplemented their diets with fresh fruit, fish, and turtle meat. Both women were said to be fond of coconut water, not only for hydration, but as a mixer with the diluted rum served as grog. A crewmate once noted that Anne Bonny ate like a man and fought like two, a phrase suggesting that she took her meals seriously, likely consuming whatever was available with gusto and without complaint. Given the composition of Rackham's crew, which included several Caribbean-born sailors and freedmen, it's likely that their food had Creole influences, with spices like allspice and chili, and stews made from root vegetables, salted fish, and plantains. Calico Jack Rackham himself, though remembered primarily for his flamboyant fashion sense, he was known for wearing brightly colored jackets and silk sashes, was said to have a sweet tooth. Testimonies from trials after his capture refer to his fondness for dried fruit, candied ginger, and molasses-based treats. On rare occasions, when sugar was plentiful, the cook reportedly made slabs of biscuit baked with treacle and nutmeg, which Rackham especially enjoyed. His preference for sweets may have mirrored his love of pleasure and theatricality, traits that earned him a place in both pirate legend and the gallows. Moving eastward to the Barbary coast, we encounter Redbeard, or Harridan Barbarossa, the Ottoman corsair who ruled the Mediterranean with a fleet that dwarfed many European navies. Barbarossa, though technically a state-sponsored privateer, functioned in many of the same ways as a pirate trading ships, establishing fortified coastal strongholds and terrorizing merchant routes. His status as a higher-ranking Ottoman admiral, however, meant that he lived and dined with a certain level of opulence, even at sea. Barbarossa's meals reflected the cuisine of North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. He was known to favor dishes like roasted lamb, spiced lentil stews, and flatbreads dipped in olive oil and za'atar. His ships carried dates, figs, and almonds, both for sustenance and as luxury items. Dried apricots and sugared citrus peels were common in his personal stores. Unlike many of his Caribbean counterparts, Barbarossa had access to trained cooks, and meals aboard his flagships were often communal, lavish affairs. He reportedly held banquets in port towns like Algiers and Tunis, where platters of rice pilaf, grilled meats, and honeyed pastries were laid out beneath the stars. Food, for Barbarossa, was not just fuel, it was a display of power and civilization, a message to allies and enemies alike that his brand of piracy had grandeur. A different kind of pirate operated in the waters of the South China Sea. Zheng Yi Sao, also known as Qing Shi, the widow-turned-fleet commander, who ruled over more than 300 junks and tens of thousands of pirates in the early 19th century. Under her leadership, pirate activity in the region reached unprecedented scale. Her command extended not only to military affairs, but to logistics, including the feeding of her vast floating army. Chinese maritime cuisine emphasized rice, dried fish, fermented vegetables, and pickled eggs. Qing Shi's fleets were known to carry barrels of soy sauce, vinegar, and rice wine, and her ships regularly raided coastal villages, not for gold, but for grain stores, pigs, ducks, and chickens. She maintained floating markets within her fleet, where fresh catches were traded, and different vessels specialized in different tasks: cooking, butchering, storage, and preservation. Aboard her flagship, meals might include steamed buns, braised pork belly, and salted greens. Food was central to discipline. She reportedly maintained strict rules about rationing and theft, with harsh punishments for any who stole from communal stores. Even pirates with shorter reigns left impressions of their appetites. Stede Bonnet, the so-called gentleman pirate, was a former landowner who, disillusioned with plantation life, took to piracy with disastrous results. He often hosted more formal meals aboard his ship, attempting to emulate aristocratic dining with linen napkins, goblets, and multiple courses, even as his crew grew increasingly mutinous. His stores reportedly included pickled vegetables, cheese wheels, and bottled wine, but his affectation for fancy dining alienated him from his hardened crew. He was mocked for his table manners and tendency to recite grace before meals. Food, in Bonnet's case, became a marker of class divisiono-tragicomic mismatch between landowner sensibility and seaborne reality. Then there was Black Bart Roberts, a Welsh pirate who was as ruthless in battle as he was disciplined in governance. His articles prohibited drinking on duty, gambling, and even profanity. He reportedly encouraged his men to eat sparingly and drink cautiously, preferring simple meals like biscuit, dried fruit, and wine. Though not a gourmand, he was deeply concerned with order, and mealtime reflected that. He maintained a strict schedule for meals and insisted that everyone be fed equally and punctually. His cook was said to be among the best in the Atlantic, and he took pride in ensuring that no one went hungry so long as they obeyed the rules. Robert's leadership style mirrored his food philosophy, modest, fair, and tightly controlled. Many pirate crews were not composed of famous names, but of nameless, faceless men and women whose food preferences have been lost to time. But in surviving logbooks, court testimonies, and sailors' journals, we catch glimpses of the ordinary favorites. Boiled fish seasoned with salt, bannocks cooked on hot stones, plantains fried in pork fat, corn cakes with honey, roasted turtle eggs, and, above all, anything fresh, be it a mango pulled from a tree, a goat butchered on an island, or a loaf of bread still warm from a baker's oven. In the end, the favorite foods of famous pirates reveal them not as monsters or caricatures, but as people, complex, flawed, and hungry. Their preferences tell us about their origins, their travels, their values, and their desires. Blackbeard's love of stews speaks to his theatricality and need for comfort. Calico Jack's sweet tooth mirrors his pursuit of pleasure. Ching Shi's rice and vinegar reflect discipline and pragmatism. Even Bonnet's silverware speaks volumes about the tragic comedy of a man out of place. Food, in these lives, was more than mere necessity. It was an expression of identity, a form of connection, and occasionally a taste of the world they had left behind or were trying to build anew. Behind the myths of swashbuckling glory and golden treasure lies a grittier truth about pirate life, one steeped in disease, fatigue, malnutrition, and death. The daily diet aboard a pirate ship, while occasionally spiced with stolen luxuries, was most often monotonous, nutrient-poor, and unbalanced. Over time, this took a serious toll on the health of every crew member. In this chapter, we examine how the typical pirate diet shaped their bodies, minds, and mortality. We will look not only at what they ate, but what they lacked, and how those deficiencies manifested in everything from scurvy-ravaged gums to bouts of delirium and death. If food was a source of survival, it was also the beginning of sickness. To begin with, let us examine the nutritional reality of a pirate's standard rations. The daily staples of most pirate diets were hardtack, salted beef or pork, and some form of dried legumes, such as peas or beans. These items were chosen not for their nutritional value, but for their shelf stability, their ability to endure weeks or even months at sea without spoiling. However, this shelf-stable diet lacked many of the essential vitamins and minerals necessary for long-term health. Perhaps the most infamous illness to haunt the high seas was scurvy, a disease caused by a deficiency of vitamin C. Because pirates often went for extended periods without fresh fruits or vegetables, scurvy was rampant. Many pirates, who seemed healthy upon embarking, were reduced to moaning skeletons within weeks. The disease crept in silently and often fatally. Entire crews succumbed. Men would lie on the deck, their teeth falling out, too weak to stand, groaning as their gums split and their limbs swelled. The knowledge of how to prevent scurvy was poorly understood during much of the golden age of piracy. Some captains noticed that citrus fruits seemed to have a curative effect, but it wasn't until the mid-18th century that the link between citrus and scurvy prevention was widely accepted. Pirates, ever resourceful, sometimes carried oranges, limes, or even pickled vegetables, but these were luxuries, often consumed early in the voyage or reserved for officers. A lucky raid on a merchant ship carrying citrus might stave off the disease for a while, but for most pirates, the slow rot of scurvy was an occupational hazard. Beyond scurvy, other nutritional deficiencies plagued the pirate body. A lack of vitamin B1 could lead to beriberi, a disease causing muscle wasting, confusion, and heart failure. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, weakened bones and deformed limbs. Pellagra, from lack of niacin, brought on dermatitis, diarrhea, and dementia. These diseases were especially prevalent among pirates who relied too heavily on cornmeal or polished rice without supplementing their diets with proteins or fats. Many pirates hailed from impoverished backgrounds and were already malnourished when they joined a crew, meaning they brought weakened immune systems and pre-existing deficiencies onto the ship, and in extreme cases, kidney stress or failure. The water itself was often no better. Stored in barrels that quickly grew stagnant and green, water was frequently teeming with bacteria. Drinking it led to dysentery, cholera, and other gastrointestinal illnesses. Pirates countered this by mixing water with alcohol grogbull, believing that the alcohol would kill harmful pathogens. While this worked to an extent, it came at the cost of increased alcohol consumption, leading to liver damage, dependency, and impaired judgment. Pirates were renowned for their consumption of rum, brandy, and other spirits. Alcohol was not only a beverage, it was medicine, morale booster, and currency. It dulled pain, warmed the body, and calmed the nerves. But the over-reliance on alcohol created its own health issues. Chronic drunkenness weakened the liver, impaired decision-making, and made it more likely for pirates to injure themselves in accidents or fights. Withdrawal symptoms, when alcohol ran dry, included tremors, hallucinations, and in severe cases, delirium tremens, a life-threatening form of withdrawal. Pirates also suffered from a host of infectious diseases, many of which were exacerbated by poor nutrition. Typhus, tuberculosis, syphilis, and malaria were common among sailors, and the crowded, unsanitary conditions of a pirate ship offered the perfect environment for their spread. Skin diseases like scabies, fungal infections, and ulcers afflicted pirates who couldn't properly clean themselves or their clothes. Mosquitoes and lice thrived in the heat of the tropics, biting at exposed skin and leaving pirates scratching until sores became infected. The cook, often seen as the crew's caretaker, did his best to manage and prevent illness through food. He might steep herbal teas from dried mint or ginger to soothe stomachs. If garlic was available, it was crushed into stews for its supposed antiseptic properties. Vinegar was used to rinse wounds or clean utensils, but these were meager defenses. Without proper nutrition and sanitation, sickness was inevitable. The cook could stretch rations, boil out parasites, and stir stew with medicinal roots, but he could not make up for the fundamental lack of a balanced diet. One of the cook's critical responsibilities was identifying spoiled or contaminated food, a task that grew harder with each passing week at sea. Meat turned slimy and smelled of rot. Biscuits grew black with mold or crawled with weevils. Beans fermented in their sacks. Consuming such food could lead to food poisoning, which, in the absence of medical care, could kill. Pirates who developed severe diarrhea or vomiting quickly became dehydrated and weak. Sometimes the solution was simply to drink grog and hope the body could endure. Other times, the sick were laid on deck, shaded with canvas, and left to recover or die. The psychological toll of poor nutrition and illness was immense. Pirates weakened by disease or hunger became despondent, irritable, or paranoid. Depression and anxiety flourished, often unacknowledged and untreated. In the worst cases, delirium and hallucinations set in, particularly among those suffering from advanced scurvy or alcoholism. Pirates spoke of seeing ghosts, hearing voices, or becoming convinced that crewmates were plotting against them. These mental breaks could lead to violence, suicide, or the accused being thrown overboard in fits of mass hysteria. Yet not all pirates were doomed to sickness. Some captains, particularly those with naval experience or connections to merchant suppliers, made health a priority. They ensured regular stops at ports for fresh provisions, kept stores of pickled cabbage, dried citrus peel, and vinegar, and rotated their food stores to prevent spoilage. A few even experimented with gardens aboard ship, growing small herbs or onions in wooden boxes placed on deck. These measures, while rare, allowed some crews to remain healthier for longer periods and perform better in raids. The demographics of the crew also influenced health. Pirate ships often included men from Africa, the Caribbean, and indigenous communities, many of whom brought with them traditional knowledge of medicinal plants and natural remedies. Some pirates boiled tree bark to make fever-reducing tea. Others used crushed herbs to pack wounds or applied honey to burns. These practices were not universal, but where they existed, they provided a lifeline in a world otherwise devoid of medicine. In port, pirates sought out foods they lacked at sea. They gorged on fresh vegetables, fruits, seafood, eggs, and milk, hoping to replenish lost nutrients. Taverns and brothels often served greasy, rich meals, roasted fowl, baked pies, and buttered bread delights that temporarily erased the lean months behind them. For some, these indulgences were restorative. For others, they were the last good meal they would ever have before the next voyage claimed them. Finally, there was the grim economy of sickness. Pirates who grew too ill to work were often left behind. If the ship could spare the resources, they might be dropped at a friendly port with a few coins and a warning not to draw attention. More often, they were marooned, cast off on small islands with a pistol and a day's rations. Sickness was not just a personal burden, it was a threat to the entire crew. One man coughing blood could signal a coming outbreak. In these moments, food was not only about recovery, it was about containment. The cook's ladle, the captain's orders, and the quartermaster's rationing all became instruments of triage. In the end, the pirate's diet tells a dual story, one of survival and decline. It reveals a world in which every bite was a gamble, every meal a negotiation between need and risk. Pirates lived hard, and died harder, and their food so often inadequate, infested, or spoiled both fueled their freedom and undermined it. The sea offered escape from the laws of kings and empires, but it offered no escape from biology. The human body, starved of nutrients and subjected to relentless strain, withered just the same whether wrapped in silks or tatters. In the world of pirates, where kings held no sway and nations were mere distant ideas, order did not vanish, simply transformed. Far from being lawless, pirate ships operated under strict codes of conduct that governed everything from loot distribution to interpersonal conflict. At the heart of this governance lay something both deeply ordinary and crucially important: food. What was eaten, how it was shared, who received it, and what happened when supplies dwindled. All of it was shaped by a unique set of maritime customs and democratic principles that pirates developed to preserve fairness, efficiency, and survival. In this chapter, we examine how food laws were codified in pirate societies, how they reflected the spirit of pirate democracy, and how meals became the bedrock of social order aboard a ship of thieves. The foundation of pirate law was the ship's articles, also known as the Pirate Code. Far from being a mythical concept, these articles were very real and often written down, signed, or sworn to by every crew member at the start of a voyage. While the content of these codes varied slightly from crew to crew, they often included remarkably detailed regulations about rations and meals. The inclusion of food laws in these articles speaks to the central importance of sustenance in pirate life. Just as a kingdom might legislate land ownership and taxes, pirate ships legislated bread and rum. One of the most common clauses found in pirate articles was the promise of equal shares. This did not just apply to treasure, but to food and drink. Most crews believed that each man, regardless of background or skill, deserved an equal portion of rations. This commitment was both ideological and practical. Pirates, many of whom had fled the rigid class systems of navy ships or plantation life, sought to build a floating society of equals. A sailor who once watched officers dine on fresh meat while he gnawed on weevil biscuit would now expect the same cut of pork as his captain. This equality was enforced, not assumed. Many articles stated that tampering with rations, stealing food, or hoarding were punishable offenses, sometimes by whipping, loss of pay, or even marooning. One surviving code from Captain Bartholomew Roberts' ship stated, "He that shall be found guilty of taking any food from another man's mess shall suffer such punishment as the company shall think fit." In this way, food theft was considered not just a personal betrayal, but a threat to the entire social fabric. If one man ate more, another might starve. In the confined and communal world of a pirate ship, fairness in food was non-negotiable. Beyond the sharing of rations, the articles also addressed the role of the ship's cook. The cook was not always a trained chef. He was often a sailor who had lost a limb or was otherwise unfit for combat, but he held a position of influence and trust. The cook was responsible not only for preparing meals, but for distributing them fairly, monitoring food stores, and keeping pests and spoilage in check. A dishonest or incompetent cook could be removed by vote, and in some crews, cooks were elected or required to take oaths before assuming their duties. This delegation of power reflected a deep awareness among pirates. Food was not just sustenance, it was currency, power, and peacekeeping. Pirate democracy extended to decision-making about food supplies, especially when the ship reached a crisis point. If barrels ran low or the voyage ran long, the crew did not rely solely on the captain to decide who would eat what. Instead, they would often hold a vote, choosing to reduce portions equally across the board or to rotate fasting among members. Some crews created rationing committees, temporary councils, empowered to manage the stores and prevent cheating. These were not symbolic gestures. In a system where every man had a stake, and where starvation was a real threat, collective responsibility was taken seriously. Even drinking was subject to democratic control. Though pirates are famous for their love of rum, their articles often included strict provisions against overindulgence. Many codes banned drinking during battle or before raids. Others specified how grog was to be mixed and distributed, often with the quartermaster or cook watering it down to avoid drunkenness. Again, the aim was not prudery, but pragmatism. A drunk crew could not sail, could not fight, and could not survive. By regulating alcohol consumption, pirates protected their collective efficiency. The quartermaster, the second most powerful figure aboard ship after the captain, often had direct oversight of food and provisions. He was in charge of dividing loot, managing inventory, and ensuring fairness in daily life. If the cook was the provider, the quartermaster was the arbiter. Disputes over unequal portions, spoiled food, or theft often went through him. His authority to mediate food-related conflicts was considered essential to the ship's cohesion. The quartermaster also made decisions about when to resupply, what ports to stop in, and whether certain goods were worth the risk of a detour. Pirate democracy also influenced how the crew handled scarcity and surplus. In times of plenty, after a successful raid or lucky fishing haul, pirates often held feasts, complete with music, stories, and generous helpings. These moments were both celebratory and symbolic, reinforcing the communal bond and reminding everyone of why they had chosen this life. In these feasts, no man went hungry, and even the lowest-ranked crewman received his full share. Food became a reward, a unifier, and a ritual of gratitude. Conversely, when times were lean, pirates developed a surprisingly egalitarian austerity. Meals were reduced for all, not just the unskilled or unpopular. Some ships implemented a lottery system where a few men would fast each day, while others received full portions. The next day, the roles would rotate. This prevented resentment and preserved morale. It was a hard life, but not an unfair one. When hunger hit, it hit all. Interestingly, the punishment for food crimes was often more severe than for other offenses. A man who insulted the captain might be put in irons for a day, but a man who hoarded salt pork or tampered with the grog barrel might be flogged publicly or cast adrift. This disparity reflected the deep anxiety surrounding food, a limited, vital resource on which everyone depended. Food was not abstract property, was life itself, and stealing it was akin to attempted murder in the eyes of the crew. There were also unwritten rules, social expectations that, while not codified, were enforced by custom and peer pressure. For instance, it was considered poor form to waste food, to complain excessively about meals, or to take more than your share of fresh catches. A man who violated these norms might find himself ostracized, denied favors, or excluded from dice games and camaraderie. The ship's mess table, if such a thing existed, was both a source of sustenance and a crucible of character. How a pirate behaved around food said a great deal about his values, his loyalties, and his discipline. Pirate food laws also intersected with their codes of conduct during raids. When attacking merchant ships, Pirates often prioritized the capture of food, drink, and medicine before treasure. Articles sometimes included clauses guaranteeing the fair division of captured provisions, and ships that landed a particularly rich food haul would hold a special election to decide how to divide it. Sometimes it was distributed evenly. Other times, crew members could barter for better items by offering up pieces of plunder or labor. Even the act of marooning, one of the most feared punishments a pirate could face, involved food law. Pirates did not simply throw the condemned man into the sea. Instead, they left him with a pistol and a day's worth of rations, often a flask of water, a biscuit, and some dried meat. This grim ration was not an act of mercy, but of ritual justice. The marooned man's food symbolized his final link to the crew, a last bite of the communal life he had betrayed. All of this reveals that, far from being chaotic or whimsical, pirate food culture was grounded in law, equity, and mutual accountability. These laws did not emerge from theory, but from the crucible of survival. A pirate ship was a closed ecosystem. If one man starved, others might follow. If food distribution became a source of resentment, the entire crew could fracture. And if rations ran out due to incompetence or greed, the ship might fall apart in open mutiny. Pirate democracy was not utopian, it was pragmatic, born from necessity, and nowhere was that necessity more immediate than at mealtime. In conclusion, food laws aboard pirate ships were more than mere rules about what to eat. They were the bones of pirate democracy, the scaffolding that held together a society of rebels, misfits, and dreamers. By codifying fairness in meals, pirates created a miniature republic afloat a space where justice was measured, not just in gold doubloons, but in spoonfuls of stew and crusts of bread. These laws helped ensure survival, fostered unity, and reminded every man aboard that, even in lawlessness, there could be order so long as the biscuits were shared. When we imagine pirates and their provisions, our minds often conjure images of salt, pork, hardtack, and barrels of rum. Yet, lost amid the smoked meats and grog-soaked legends is a softer, sweeter truth. Pirates had a serious sweet tooth. Sugar, molasses, dried fruits, honey, and candied nuts weren't just occasional indulgences. They were deeply valued, passionately pursued, and, in some cases, stolen in staggering quantities. These sweet provisions were more than tasty distractions. They were symbols of comfort, power, and trade. In this chapter, we peel back the crust of the pirates' crusty lifestyle to uncover their love of sweetness, their role in the sugar trade, and how the pursuit of dessert was tangled up in some of the darkest chapters of maritime history. To understand the pirate craving for sweets, we must first understand how rare sugar once was. In early 17th century Europe, sugar was an expensive delicacy, prized by the wealthy and used sparingly as a seasoning, not just a sweetener. By the late 1600s, however, sugar began flowing from the Caribbean plantations, where enslaved labor transformed tropical cane into glistening white crystals at an industrial scale. This sugar boom made it possible for Pirate Sivan, the lowest deck sailor, to taste what had once been reserved for royalty. For the pirate, sugar was a literal treasure. Ships laden with barrels of raw or refined sugar made tempting targets. Captains often prioritized intercepting these sugar ships because they promised both immediate comfort and a high resale value at port. A single raid on a West Indiaman might yield hundreds of pounds of muscovado sugar, along with molasses, rum, candied ginger, and preserved fruit sidums that could be divided among the crew or used to curry favor with merchants and tavern owners. To a pirate crew, fresh off a hard voyage of briny biscuits and salted meat, the sight of dripping molasses or a handful of raisins was enough to inspire songs, toasts, and fierce loyalty. Molasses, dark, syrupy, and abundant, was a particular favorite among pirates. Though less refined than sugar, it was easier to store, more versatile, and readily consumed. Pirates mixed molasses into grog to soften its harshness, spooned it into porridge, spread it on biscuit, and even ate it straight when supplies allowed. The sweetness of molasses brought a moment of relief, a contrast to the otherwise bitter textures of life at sea. Some pirate cooks would stew dried apples in molasses, or roll biscuits in it to create a rough kind of dessert sea coke, as some sailors jokingly called it. Honey was another sought-after commodity, albeit more rarely encountered. Unlike molasses, honey had medicinal uses and was treasured for its preservative qualities. Pirates who raided Mediterranean ports or coastal villages in North Africa sometimes came across jars of local honey, which were treated almost like medicine. A spoonful of honey might be reserved for the sick, the wounded, or used as an offering in makeshift rituals. When mixed with herbs, honey could coat sore throats or ease digestion. When mixed with rum, it created a soothing balm for the body and spirit alike. But it wasn't only liquid sugars that captured the pirate imagination. Dried and candied fruits were wildly popular aboard pirate vessels. Raisins, figs, dates, and even dried mango or papaya became valuable commodities, not just for their taste, but for their long shelf life. These fruits were often added to rice or porridge, served at celebratory meals, or quietly hoarded by hungry crewmen. Candied ginger, in particular, was both a treat and a medicine, used to ease seasickness and soothe the stomach. One surviving ship's log from a Caribbean pirate sloop noted a small stash of crystallized fruit in boxes of tin, seized from a French merchant vessel, likely destined for a noble's banquet table, before it ended up in the rough hands of pirates. The sweetness of these items did more than please the tongue. They offered psychological comfort. Life aboard a pirate ship was dirty, dangerous, and unpredictable. Sweet food reminded sailors of home, of holidays, and of their former lives, of cakes their mothers baked, candies from village markets, or the warmth of a spiced drink by a hearth. Just as a modern comfort food can soothe a rough day, sweet items aboard pirate vessels functioned as emotional anchors, bright spots amid a bleak and briny existence. In fact, sweets often served as rewards. After a successful raid, or when morale was low, the cook might pull out a hidden stash of sugar or dried fruit to share with the crew. These small indulgences lifted spirits and fostered camaraderie. A man who received a fig or a biscuit drizzled in molasses after surviving a storm might feel renewed, not just from the sugar, but from the recognition of his endurance. These moments became rituals of their own, often accompanied by song, laughter, or tales of past glories. A shared treat, no matter how small, was a reminder that one was part of a crew, not just a cog in a ruthless machine. However, the story of pirates and sweets is also inseparable from the brutality of the sugar trade. The very sugar they craved was cultivated in fields of horror Caribbean plantations, where enslaved Africans toiled under brutal conditions. Pirates, though often painted as anti-establishment rogues, were complicit in this economy. They raided sugar shipments, traded stolen sugar, and even sold sugar to colonial merchants who profited from slavery. In rare cases, pirate crews freed enslaved people, some of whom joined the crews. But just as often, pirates captured enslaved workers and sold them themselves. This dark connection reveals the complexity of pirate morality. Though many pirates rejected national loyalties and claimed a kind of brotherhood across races and ranks, they were not immune to the temptations of profit. Sugar was money. A successful raid on a sugar ship didn't just feed the crew, it funded repairs, bought influence, and kept the dream of freedom afloat. The sweetness in the pirates' mouths, then, was often tainted by the bitterness of exploitation. Still, some pirate societies, especially those operating in the fringes of empire, developed more egalitarian approaches to sugar and trade. The so-called Republic of Pirates in Nassau, for example, operated in the early 18th century as a kind of rogue colony, where pirates, freedmen, and outlaws coexisted under informal codes of conduct. Here, sugar might be traded not just as cargo, but as shared bounty divided among crews without regard to class or background. In such environments, sugar ceased to be a symbol of aristocratic luxury and became a tool of pirate democracy, a reward for risk, a flavor of freedom. One cannot overstate the role that sweets played in pirate ports, either. In places like Port Royal, Tortuga, or Nassau, taverns sold sugarcane rum, candied nuts, and fruit pies to returning crews flush with gold and ready to celebrate. These ports became known not only for their debauchery, but for their culinary indulgence. Pirates spent their shares on pastries, sugar loaves, and spiced cakes baked fresh by local women or imported from passing merchant ships. These confections, though fleeting, were some of the most decadent pleasures a pirate might ever know. Interestingly, sweets also appeared in pirate superstition and symbolism. Some believed that carrying a lump of sugar in one's pocket would bring good luck during a raid, or that burning a bit of molasses before a voyage would ensure smooth winds. While such beliefs were not widespread, they reflected a deeper emotional connection to these rare commodities. Sugar and sweets had become tokens of hope in an otherwise grim life. The recipes, such as they were, passed informally among crews. One common treat was sailor's pudding, a mixture of crushed biscuit, molasses, and dried fruit pressed into a ball and left to harden in the sun. Another was the so-called pirate tart, flatbread, cooked on a hot pan and smeared with jam or mashed banana. When pirates raided merchant kitchens, they sometimes attempted full desserts, using sugar, flour, and fat to recreate cakes they'd known in their past lives. These efforts rarely turned out as intended, but were beloved nonetheless for their ambition and sentiment. As the 18th century progressed and sugar became cheaper and more widespread, its presence aboard ships only increased. Even naval vessels began issuing molasses or sugar syrup as part of rations, hoping to keep morale up and energy high. Pirates, ever opportunistic, kept pace raiding, bartering, and stashing their own sweet supplies, often hidden away from greedy fingers or reserved for special days. In death, too, pirates occasionally tasted sweetness. There are stories, likely apocryphal, of dying pirates being fed a spoonful of sugar water, or being buried with a lump of sugar beneath the tongue as a symbol of peace. Whether these tales are fact or fancy, they underscore a deep cultural truth that amid the violence, hunger, and hardship of life at sea, the sweetness of a plum, a spoonful of honey, or a crumb of cake was not just a pleasure, it was a promise that life could still surprise you with kindness. In the end, pirates weren't so different from the rest of us. Their knives were sharper, their lives harder, their codes stranger. But they, too, longed for the small luxuries that made life more bearable. A splash of molasses in the grog, a handful of raisins in a stew, a tart baked in a stolen pan. These were not just food, they were memories, celebrations, dreams, sweetness. For the pirate was rebellion against the bitterness of fate. The ocean was a constant companion to the pirate, sometimes a provider, often a threat, and always a mystery. Pirates lived by the sea, fought upon it, died in its depths, and, crucially, drew their food from it. When salted pork ran low or biscuit turned black with rot, pirates turned to the waters around them for sustenance. Fish and shellfish became the backup pantry, the fallback meal, and in many cases, a lifeline. But the sea was more than a source of food. It was home to superstitions, mythical creatures, and tales of beasts that blurred the line between hunger and horror. In this chapter, we dive into the pirate's relationship with oceanic fare, from the everyday catch to the whispered stories of monstrous things best left uncaught. Let's begin with the practical. Pirates fished. Despite what romantic illustrations might suggest, they did not always rely solely on stolen provisions or traded goods. Many ships carried fishing lines, nets, and hooks, specifically for emergency food gathering. Pirates, who had once been fishermen or coastal laborers, brought with them the knowledge of how to trap, clean, and preserve marine life. In calmer waters, especially when becalmed or lying in wait, crews would drop lines overboard in search of fish. Mackerel, cod, haddock, snapper, and flying fish were frequent catches, depending on the region. Fishing was a shared task, often done in shifts, and any sizable haul was divided communally. Cooking fish aboard ship required improvisation. There were no ovens or skilled butchers, just a single firebox, often on a metal tray filled with sand to prevent the risk of flames spreading. Most fish were pan-fried or boiled, sometimes stewed with onions, dried herbs, or whatever else could be scrounged from stores. In Caribbean waters, pirates frequently caught barracuda, tuna, and mahi-mahi. These were typically gutted and roasted whole. If citrus or vinegar was available, the fish might be cooked in acid, producing a rudimentary ceviche. On colder seas, salted or smoked fish became a staple. A large fish could be preserved for several days if brined and dried properly on deck, then hung from rigging to cure in the sun. Shellfish were also an important part of the pirate diet, especially when ships anchored near reefs, coves, or estuaries. Pirates waded into shallow water to collect clams, mussels, oysters, and crabs. These were boiled in seawater or roasted over coals, eaten simply with bread or grog. A stew of mussels, beans, and dried sausage was considered a luxury on some ships, especially those with Mediterranean or Portuguese influence. In tropical waters, crews sometimes found lobsters, sea urchins, or conchs, many of which were unfamiliar to European-born pirates, but readily eaten by African or indigenous crew members who shared cooking methods and preservation techniques. In port, pirates eagerly bought or stole preserved fish goods, dried anchovies, sardines packed in oil, or smoked eels. These items lasted longer than fresh meat and could be eaten cold, straight from the barrel. Eel pies, popular in English seafaring tradition, were sometimes attempted aboard ship using saltwater eels caught near shore. While preparation was tricky without proper pastry or baking equipment, some crews made simplified versions. eel chunks boiled with root vegetables, then thickened with flour and fat to make a kind of paste or sea pudding. Yet not all sea life was welcomed. Some fish, especially in unfamiliar regions, were viewed with deep suspicion. A bright color or strange texture could mean toxicity. Pirate cooks learned to avoid species associated with ciguatera poisoning, such as certain types of reef fish that became toxic after feeding on algae. One mistake could send half a crew into vomiting fits. As such, cooking and consumption were often accompanied by rituals. Some sailors would watch the ship's cats or rats sniff a fish first, assuming if the animal avoided it, so should they. Sharks presented a more complex relationship. Feared and admired in equal measure, sharks were sometimes hunted by pirates as both a food source and a challenge. Shark meat, when prepared properly soaked to remove urea, then heavily salted or spiced, was edible and filling. In desperate situations, it was life-saving, but the symbolism of the shark went far deeper. Too many pirates, especially those from African or indigenous traditions, the shark was a spirit of the sea, a creature not to be trifled with lightly. Stories abounded of sharks following doomed ships, waiting for souls to fall overboard. Some pirates, particularly in the Caribbean, wore shark teeth as talismans, believed to ward off drowning or ensure a swift death rather than slow starvation. Whales were less frequently hunted by pirates, as they required coordinated effort, specialized tools, and time luxuries most pirate ships could not afford. But, on occasion, pirates came across stranded whales or scavenged from dead ones. Whale blubber, when rendered, could be used for fuel or even traded. Whale meat, however, was not a favorite toily and tough. It was considered food of last resort. More often, pirates traded whale goods seized from whalers, oil, bone, and baleen, all valuable commodities in European markets. Beyond the edible, the sea inspired awe, fear, and legend. Pirates were superstitious men, and nowhere was this more evident than in their tales of sea monsters. These stories, passed around campfires or whispered on moonlit decks, blurred the line between truth and terror. Sailors spoke of giant octopuses, able to drag entire ships beneath the waves, of serpentine beasts that slithered across the water at night, of fish with human eyes and devilish smiles. While today we understand these as exaggerations or misidentification, squid, mistaken for kraken, whales for sea serpents, believed deeply and truly in the existence of monsters. Food and myth intertwined. In some cultures, it was believed that eating the meat of certain fish could bestow powers or curses. Pirates, who had spent time in African or indigenous communities, sometimes adopted these beliefs, refusing to eat particular sea creatures for fear of illness or madness. Stories spread of men who ate the liver of a spirit fish and began to dream of drowning every night, or of those who caught an eel with a human-like face and were found dead the next morning, their mouths full of sand. Even something as ordinary as a squid could become the subject of fear if caught in the wrong place or at the wrong time. Yet for all the fear, there was also reverence. The sea was seen not only as a provider of food, but as a living entity, a mother with moods and intentions. Some pirates poured the first ladle of fish stew overboard as an offering. Others threw the bones of their catch into the waves, believing the sea would grow angry if not given its due. These practices, though varied and inconsistent, showed how deeply pirates understood their dependence on the ocean. The sea fed them, yes, but only if it wished to. In periods of prolonged hardship, when even fishing failed, and stores ran dry. Pirates turned to the least glamorous sources of protein: jellyfish, seaweed, and seabirds. Seaweed, particularly varieties like kelp and dulse, was boiled or dried and eaten like jerky. Jellyfish, when caught and washed, could be fried into translucent patties, rubbery but edible. Seabirds, including gulls and cormorants, were shot or trapped and roasted over open flames. Their meat was tough and fishy, but in moments of desperation, no food was refused. Eggs, stolen from rocky nests, were a prized delicacy, often hoarded by the cook and traded among the crew like coins. The sea also offered unexpected bounty: driftwood with edible barnacles, floating coconuts, dead fish washed ashore. Pirates learned to scan the horizon, not just for sails, but for signs of life and nourishment. A flock of birds might lead to an island with shellfish. A slick on the water's surface might hint at a school of tuna. A sudden shift in watercolor might suggest shallow reefs rich in crabs. Pirate survival was as much about reading the sea as fighting upon it. Finally, we must consider the cultural exchange that came with oceanic foodways. Pirate crews were diverse, often comprising Europeans, Africans, indigenous peoples, and escaped enslaved men. Each brought their own culinary knowledge and attitudes toward seafood. African sailors taught others how to trap crabs using woven baskets. Caribbean natives showed which reef fish were safe to eat. Muslim or Jewish pirates, though rare, brought specific taboos and preparations that influenced how food was handled. The pirate ship became a floating kitchen of fusion cuisine, where salted cod from England met coconut milk from the tropics, or where eel was stuffed with peppers and rice before being grilled over open flame. In the end, the sea was both banquet and beast-feeding the pirate and frightening him in equal measure. Fish and shellfish may have lacked the drama of gold doubloons, but they sustained the pirate dream. They were the daily miracle, the humble prize beneath the waves and the monsters. Whether real or imagined, they reminded every pirate that no matter how far he sailed from kings and crowns, he was never far from mystery, and never free from the ocean's ancient appetite. The sea was a hard, lean lifeful of wind-chapped lips, meager portions, and food that challenged the stomach more than it satisfied the soul. But when pirates made port, all of that changed. In the coastal towns and island enclaves where they sought refuge, pirates ate like kings, at least for a little while. Freed from the constraints of salted meat and hardtack, they indulged in foods fresh, fatty, and flavorful. These feasts ashore were more than mere meals. They were acts of joy, relief, reunion, and often reckless abandon. In this chapter, we'll step ashore with the pirates of Nassau, Tortuga, Port Royal, and a dozen lesser-known hideaways to explore what and how pirates ate when they weren't confined to a rocking deck and a weevil-riddled barrel. To understand the gastronomic explosion of pirate feasting, we must start with what they longed for at sea. After weeks or months afloat, the body craved fresh produce, soft bread, and warm meals cooked over real flames. The average pirate yearned for fruit that wasn't dried, meat that wasn't salted, water that didn't smell of algae, and anything, absolutely anything, that could be considered a dessert. Their cravings were not only physical but emotional. A ripe mango or a buttered roll could stir memories of childhood or tavern nights past. Pirates were often poor men raised on modest fare, and port towns were where they could relive the comfort of ordinary food with extraordinary enthusiasm. Let's visit one of the most infamous pirate ports, Nassau, in the Bahamas, sometimes called the Pirate Republic. In the early 18th century, it was a rough-and-tumble haven of lawless indulgence. When pirates docked here, they descended on the town's taverns, cookshops, and street vendors, hungry for flavor and drunk on freedom. Cooks in Nassau catered specifically to sailors, offering roast chicken, pork stews, sweet yams, plantains, fresh fish, and thick stews spiced with allspice, peppers, and garlic. Food was served hot and fast, often accompanied by bread fried in animal fat and washed down with local rum. One of the most celebrated dishes in Nassau's taverns was pepper pot, a thick, spicy stew made from salted or smoked meat, cassava, okra, and a blend of fiery Caribbean spices. It originated in indigenous and African culinary traditions and became a pirate favorite for its richness and the way it coated the stomach after days of sea rations. Eaten with hands or with hunks of bread, pepper pot was equal parts meal and medicine. Pirates also clamored for jerk, metesipally goat or porks, moked or porks, marinated in vinegar and Scotch bonnet peppers, and served with fried dough or coconut rice. Fruit was another obsession. Pirates gorged themselves on pineapples, bananas, papayas, guavas, oranges, and limes. Not only were these fruits delicious and refreshing, they were rich in vitamin C, a nutrient pirates often lacked at sea. Tavern owners and market women knew this and sold fruit juices, fruit pies, and fruit preserves to arriving sailors, who paid handsomely for the privilege. It's said that some pirates would trade weapons or jewelry for barrels of mangoes or a week's supply of fresh citrusa. Bargain few regretted. But it wasn't only about flavor. Feasting in port had deep ritual significance. It marked the end of a voyage, the celebration of a haul, or the mourning of lost crewmates. When a crew returned from a raid, it wasn't uncommon for the captain to host a banquet of sorts, sometimes in a rented tavern hall, sometimes in a commandeered estate. Musicians played, rum flowed, and cooks prepared dishes, both humble and extravagant. Roasted suckling pigs, turtle soup, fried plantains, rice with herbs, and sweet pastries drizzled in syrup. These meals were theatrical, loud, messy, communal. They weren't just about eating, they were about belonging. Pirate ports were also places of culinary fusion. Many of the cooks who served pirates were not European, but Caribbean Creoles, free Africans, enslaved cooks, and indigenous islanders, each bringing their own traditions, ingredients, and techniques. Pirates might dine on French bouillabaisse, cooked with West African spices, or Spanish rice dishes infused with cassava and coconut milk. Even the simple act of frying dough and sweetening it with honey could become a multicultural gesture, part African beignet, part English fritter, part local invention. Let's travel next to Tortuga, off the coast of what is now Haiti. In the mid-1600s, it was a stronghold for French buccaneers and privateers. Here, food was both more rustic and more rooted in local terrain. Pirates ate wild game boar, iguana, birds as well as yams, cassava, breadfruit, and pigeon peas. One common dish was a cassava cake, made from grated cassava root mixed with pork fat, dried herbs, and a touch of cane sugar, baked on a flat iron pan and eaten hot. Fish stews, often with crab or salt cod, were cooked in big cauldrons set up on the beach, stirred with wooden paddles, and seasoned with whatever the cook could gather. Tortuga, like Nassau, was a crossroads of cultures. Enslaved Africans brought knowledge of fermented drinks. and pirates often found themselves drinking palm wine or sorrel, a sweet tan-tart hibiscus drink steeped with spices. After days of briny grog, these were revelations, fragrant, alive with color. Pirates from colder European climates, meanwhile, were stunned by the bounty of the tropics and the strength of the local flavors. What they lacked in manners, they made up for in enthusiasm. Then came Port Royal, the infamous Jamaican town dubbed the wickedest city on earth, before it sank into the sea in 1692. Here, food was tied tightly to wealth, vice, and spectacle. The wealthiest pirates dined in establishments that offered multi-course meals, stews of oxtail or goats, stuffed fish baked with almonds and raisins, coconut puddings, and hot spiced wine. Some cooks even offered early versions of ice cream, frozen mixtures of milk and sugar, chilled using saltpeter and local ice brought down from the Blue Mountains. Yet not all pirates feasted in taverns. Some ate on the beach, setting up campfires and roasting whatever they could buy or catch: turtle steaks, crabs, roasted breadfruit. Others attended food markets, where vendors sold skewers of grilled meat, fried cassava chips, pastries filled with sweetened yam, and bowls of porridge made from cornmeal, coconut milk, and cinnamon. These open-air meals were full of life music, shouting, haggling. For the pirate who had lived off dried beans and wormy biscuit, it was like entering a dream. Port cities also brought exposure to luxury imports. Pirates traded their loot for items like cheese, olives, almonds, raisins, chocolate, and coffee, especially in Spanish and Portuguese colonies. One common treat was pan de leche, a soft milk bread sometimes filled with custard or fruit preserves. In places like Havana or Veracruz, pirates could enjoy churros with sugar, coffee spiced with clove, or chocolate melted into thick drinks, a far cry from brackish water and tepid grog. But not all food in port was indulgent. For some pirates, especially those low on shares or wounded, port food was simple and sparse: a bowl of rice, a loaf of bread, a piece of dried meat. Some had to beg, barter, or steal for their meals. Others fell prey to fraudulent tavern owners who overcharged or diluted portions. In the lawless margins of pirate society, food inequality mirrored social divides, even among so-called equals. A lucky pirate feasted, an unlucky one went hungry in a city of plenty. Feasting ashore also carried dangers. Foodborne illnesses were common in crowded towns. Tavern kitchens were rarely clean, and spoiled meat or bad water could sicken an entire crew. Moreover, pirates were vulnerable when feasting, drunk, distracted, their weapons laid aside. Many were robbed, poisoned, or arrested during feasting sprees. There are records of rival pirate crews ambushing each other in taverns, fights breaking out over spilled wine or insulted cooks. The joy of eating could easily turn into a brawl or, worse still, for all the risks, pirates returned to port again and again for the pleasure of eating. These meals were ritual, celebration, therapy. Food allowed pirates to forget, if only for a night, the hardship of their lives. A hot stew could melt months of cold spray from the skin. A slice of coconut pie could remind a man why he risked life and limb. A roasted pig with pepper sauce, eaten by hand while laughing with crewmates, could become a memory that kept him alive in darker times. Portside feasting also served as emotional reconnection. Pirates who had lovers, family, or old friends in port used meals to rebuild bonds. A shared meal became a moment of intimacy, an apology for long absences, or a promise of return. In taverns, pirates formed new alliances, recruited new crew, or plotted future raids all over shared bread and rum. For all their violence, pirates understood something profound, that to eat together was to build trust. And in a world where trust was rare and betrayal common, that meant everything. In closing, pirate feasting in port was more than gluttony, it was a reclamation of humanity. These meals reminded the pirates that they were not beasts, but men, capable of joy, of taste, of tenderness. In every spiced stew and sugared fruit, they reclaimed a piece of the life they had lost or never known. And though the sea would call them back to biscuit and salt pork and grog, they carried those flavors with them, tucked into memory like treasure. A feast ashore was fleeting, but its echo lingered, sweet and warm, in the belly of every pirate bold enough to seek it. The life of a pirate was unpredictable. One day could be spent dividing gold and toasting victory. The next, a man might face death on the gallows, or find himself marooned on a barren shore. As much as pirates reveled in feast and freedom, many met their end through execution, injury, disease, or betrayal. And in those final hours, whether in a jail cell, on a scaffold, or aboard a slowly sinking ship, food took on a new meaning. In this chapter, we explore the poignant, strange, and sometimes celebratory ways pirates approached their last meals, and how food, even in death, remained a vessel of identity, memory, and defiance. Let us begin where many pirate stories end, in the hands of the law. By the early 18th century, piracy had become not only an act of rebellion, but a criminal offense pursued with vigor by the world's great naval powers. Pirates caught and tried were typically hanged. Before execution, however, many were granted what became known as the Last Supper, a final meal offered either as a customary act of Christian mercy or as a performative gesture by the authorities. These meals ranged from simple prison fares to bread and water to surprisingly elaborate feasts when pirates had wealthy friends or sympathetic jailers. In London's Marshalsea and Newgate prisons, where dozens of pirates were kept, executions were public spectacle. The condemned were often paraded through the streets, and along the way, taverns would offer food or drink, part mockery, part tradition. A famous example is Captain Kidd, the Scottish privateer turned pirate. On the eve of his hanging in 1701, it is said he was offered a large roast and a bottle of wine, which he reportedly consumed with somber calm. The following morning, he was marched to execution dock, where crowds jeered as he swung. But in that final meal, he was given a fleeting moment of dignity, a recognition, perhaps, that even a condemned man deserved one last bite of comfort. Other pirates chose to make statements with their final meals. Some refused food entirely, viewing it as an act of defiance. Others demanded extravagant or symbolic meals, entire roast goose, a barrel of oysters, or a pudding baked with stolen rum. When such requests were honored, it wasn't always out of kindness. Authorities understood that a dramatic final meal could increase the spectacle of the execution. The public hungered not just for justice, but for stories. A pirate's last supper became part of his myth. Among the most striking tales is that of Charles Vane, the hot-tempered English pirate known for his resistance to surrender. After his capture and imprisonment in Jamaica, he was granted a last meal of salted beef, boiled yams, and a flask of cane wine. He ate alone, reportedly muttering to himself, and left most of the food untouched. Witnesses claimed he used the bones to scratch marks on the wall of his cell, final act of rebellion. Whether true or not, Such stories demonstrate how food was woven into the theater of death for pirates, becoming both sustenance and symbol. But not all last meals were served in cells. Many pirates died at sea, either from battle wounds, illness, or shipwreck. In such cases, the final meal was less ceremonial, more immediate: a bite of hardtack, a cup of grog, a bit of dried fruit from a friend's pouch. For these men, food in their last hours was about sharing, not feasting. It was common for dying sailors to be fed by crewmates, even when supplies were low. A spoonful of stew, passed hand to hand, became an act of kinship. Some pirates requested sweet things: a lump of sugar, a dried fig, a sip of honeyed rumas, a way to soften the taste of death. One poignant example comes from a ship's log belonging to a pirate sloop off the coast of Hispaniola. A gunner named Reuben, mortally wounded in a skirmish with a British cutter, was laid in a hammock and given a bit of orange from the captain's private stores. He held it in his mouth, eyes closed, and smiled before he passed. The orange, a rare treasure aboard any ship, was not just food, it was kindness, a final sweetness before the silence. Pirates who were marooned also faced their last meals in a different light. Abandoning a man to an uninhabited island was a cruel but practiced punishment. It often came with a pistol and a day's worth of provisions, a biscuit, a flask of water or rum, and a strip of dried meat. This grim meal marked the beginning of the end for many. Some lasted days, even weeks, foraging what they could. Others died quickly, either from exposure or despair. The food left behind was a twisted gesture, the illusion of mercy, the bare minimum needed to maintain the crew's conscience. Pirates who survived often described the last meal not as sustenance, but as a mockery, a reminder of betrayal more than a tool of survival. There are accounts, however, of pirates who transformed marooning into meditation. A sailor named Giles Castoff, for theft later, recounted that he spent his first night eating slowly, savoring every bite of his biscuit while watching the stars. He said it reminded him of his mother's bread back home, and that the last meal gave him strength to begin building a raft. He was eventually rescued. To him, the Last Supper became a moment of introspection, even renewal. Among pirate crews, death rituals were informal but sincere. When a pirate died aboard ship, whether in battle or from disease, the crew might gather for a small funeral meal. If food was scarce, they offered a toast or a ration of rum in his honor. Some captains kept a special stash of tobacco, molasses, or dried cherries for such occasions. The dead man's portion was left untouched on the mess table for a time, a nod to his absence. Then, depending on custom, it might be thrown into the sea with him, shared among the crew, or set aside for a moment of quiet prayer or song. In rare instances, pirates who knew they were near death prepared their own last meals. These were not grand feasts, but intentional acts, a way to take control over one's end. A pirate dying of scurvy might use his final strength to request a specific dish: a bit of porridge sweetened with molasses, or salted fish cooked in lard. The cook, if he could, obliged. To die with familiar flavors on the tongue was a comfort. Even on the edge of nothingness, the human instinct to find meaning in a meal remained. Among the legends passed down by sailors was the tale of the ghost banquet, a superstition that when a pirate crew was doomed, they would unknowingly prepare and eat their last shared meal. This supper, it was said, would be unusually quiet. The food would taste better than usual. Laughter would feel strange, almost forced. Afterward, no one would be able to sleep. and in the morning, death would arrive. True or not, the myth reflects how deeply pirates associated food with fate, a belief that the table could reveal what lay ahead. But the most famous last meals of pirates were those taken in full view of the public and meant to be remembered. Some pirates used them to redeem themselves, others to mock their captors. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, captured in 1720, reportedly ate with appetite while awaiting sentence, joking with each other and refusing to show fear. When their executions were stayed due to pregnancy, their final meals became part of the mythos. Defiant women, eating with strength, laughing at the gallows. Calico Jack, their lover and fellow pirate, was not so lucky. On the night before his hanging, he is said to have eaten jerked beef and plantains, washed down with rum, weeping into his bowl. Whether out of regret or exhaustion, we cannot say. But even in those last bites, we glimpse a man stripped of legend, just a sailor, afraid, clutching his food as though it might keep him from the noose. Throughout all these stories, one truth remains. Food matters, even at the end. The last meal, whether shared or solitary, joyful or sorrowful, served as a final connection to life, to memory. To the humanity pirates often tried to hide beneath bravado and blade. It reminded them of home, of laughter, of simpler days before the sea took everything. And perhaps, just perhaps, it reminded them that even if death was near, taste could still triumph if only for a moment. As the sails of history disappear over the horizon and the age of piracy slips into legend, one might assume that the food of pirates vanished with it lost to salt water and time, but that would be far from true. In fact, pirate cuisine has lived on in curious ways, through myth and media, through reenactments and regional dishes, through cookbooks and cultural memory. The legacy of what pirates ate is as layered as their lives, part reality, part imagination, and part modern reinvention. This final chapter of our journey explores how the culinary world of pirates has echoed into the present, how history and fantasy have blended, and why we still sit around fires and banquet tables wondering what a pirate would eat. To begin, it helps to understand how romanticized depictions of pirates shaped public imagination, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries. Books like Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island and the plays of Gilbert and Sullivan painted pirates as colorful rogues, perpetually feasting on roasted meats and swigging rum. These portrayals often amplified the more indulgent aspects of pirate life, transforming rough, seafaring sustenance into exaggerated gluttony. Groaning tables of turkey legs, endless barrels of ale, and trays of exotic fruit became symbols of pirate lore, popularized further by films and theme parks. The reality, as we've explored, was far grittier and more diverse. But it is in this contrast between fact and fiction that pirate food has taken on a life of its own. At pirate-themed festivals, Ren fairs, and seaside taverns, from Key West to Cornwall, dishes are served in homage to this imagined past. Roasted meats, fish stews, hard bread, rum cakes, and grog appear on menus, sometimes with theatrical names like Captain's Catch, Buccaneer's Platter, or Dead Man's Pie. While not historically accurate in every detail, these meals offer a tangible connection to the myth, a way for modern diners to taste adventure. But beyond reenactments, some dishes do trace their roots directly to pirate fare. In the Caribbean, for example, the culinary influence of pirates blended with the traditions of enslaved Africans, indigenous peoples, and European colonists. Today's jerk chicken, pepper pot stew, and cassava-based breads owe as much to this fusion as they do to formal cuisine. The techniques used by pirate salting, smoking, fermenting remain in use, not just for flavor, but for their practicality in tropical climates. You can eat a dish in modern Jamaica or Martinique that is not far from what a pirate may have tasted 300 years ago. Similarly, sailor dishes of the Atlantic and North Sea echo pirate foodways. In coastal Britain, lobscouse, a stew of meat, onion, and ship's biscuit, was a staple of naval and merchant life. Its variants, like the modern scouse, still eaten in Liverpool, are remnants of a broader seafaring diet that pirates shared. In Scandinavian ports, salted fish dishes such as lutefisk or dried cod meals resemble the preserved staples of pirate ships. These foods have endured because they are practical, sustaining, and steeped in the rhythm of sea life. Modern cookbooks have also played a role in preserving and reimagining pirate cuisine. Titles like The Pirate Cookbook, A Taste of the Seven Seas, and Pirate's Pantry offer recipes with historical contexts, some speculative, others rigorously researched. Recipes include hardtack with honey glaze, sea biscuit pudding, molasses, pork roast, and Caribbean rum bread. While these dishes vary in authenticity, they help readers connect with history through their kitchens, inviting them to engage not just with facts, but with flavor. One of the most enduring symbols of pirate food is rum. Few ingredients are as tightly bound to the image of a pirate as the cask of dark, spiced liquor. While the daily grog was a watered-down and often unpleasant version, the modern legacy of pirate rum has taken a much sweeter, smoother form. Today, countless rum brands evoke pirate imagery. Captain Morgan, Kraken, Blackbeard's, Reserve each, drawing on the idea of rogue independence and tropical adventure. These rums are often used in cocktails like the Dark and Stormy, Painkiller, or Rum Punch, served in bars that echo the atmosphere of a pirate galley. Even beyond rum, the pirate's food legacy has found its way into pop culture, in film and television. From Pirates of the Caribbean to black sails characters, dine in smoky taverns, throw tankards, and dig into roasted meats or tropical fruit. These scenes, though dramatized, anchor the viewer in a sensory world that feels textured and alive. Food in these stories is a shorthand for pleasure, power, and camaraderie, just as it was for real pirates. It's a reminder that before the swordplay and cannon fire, there was always a meal to be had. Restaurants and taverns around the world continue to capitalize on this image. Pirate-themed eateries in coastal towns or tourist centers offer menus full of references to pirate meals, grilled fish platters, coconut rice, seaweed salad, seafood stews, and molasses-glazed ribs. Children drink grog from pewter mugs. Waiters dressed as swashbucklers serve dessert as plunder pie. These places thrive not just on theme, but on the idea that to eat like a pirate is to indulge, to cast aside restraint, and feast with wild joy. Interestingly, some naval institutions and maritime museums have begun including pirate food history in their exhibits. Displays feature reconstructed galley kitchens, barrels of ship's biscuit, and preserved examples of rations. Some offer tasting experiences where visitors try sailor staples, salt pork, dried peas, vinegar water, or hard cheese. While these don't always align with the romantic view of pirates, they provide historical grounding, showing how closely pirates mirrored the sailors they once were. The internet has also helped expand the pirate food legacy. Online communities devoted to historical reenactment, experimental archaeology, or survival cooking. Often try recreating pirateria meals using available ingredients and techniques. YouTube channels and blogs share recipes for sea pies, shipboard stews, or even fermented beverages based on 17th century methods. These creators blend storytelling with hands-on cooking, bridging the gap between fact and fascination. Perhaps most fascinating is how pirate food has entered the realm of symbolism. In modern media, a feast on the beach or a toast of grog isn't just sustenance's rebellion, fellowship, and transgression. In many pirate narratives, food is used to mark transformation. A starving sailor eats a stolen fruit and becomes a pirate. A crew shares a meal and declares mutiny. A captain toasts his men before a doomed voyage. These moments echo through history, reminding us that food was never neutral. It was power, it was culture, it was memory. And what of the dark side of this legacy? As we've seen, much of the food that pirates consumed, especially in port, was tied to the global systems of exploitation. Enslaved labor on sugar plantations, forced harvesting of spices, colonial plunder of indigenous food systems. This uncomfortable truth has not vanished. As we celebrate the adventurous palette of pirate lore, it's important to also acknowledge the suffering entwined in those meals. Pirate cuisine is, in some sense, a ghost story haunted by the people who grew the sugar, caught the fish, or planted the rice, yet never feasted themselves. Still, there is something worth preserving in the pirate approach to food, not the theft or cruelty, but the celebration of the moment, the joy of a simple stew after hardship, the shared plum in a time of hunger. Pirates knew that food wasn't just for living, it was for remembering, for claiming one's place in a hostile world, for tasting, if only briefly, a bit of freedom. In the end, the legacy of pirate cuisine is not about exact recipes or strict history. It's about imagination, resilience, and curiosity. It's about reaching across centuries to touch the lives of people who lived hard, sailed far, and ate with gusto when they could. To eat like a pirate today is not just to eat. It is to tell a story of sea winds and firelight, of hunger and laughter, of bitter salt and sweet molasses. So, as our voyage comes to a close, let us raise a cup of rum, or cider, or grog, if you daren't toast the meals that kept these seafaring outlaws alive. For every biscuit they bit, every stew they stirred, and every plum they passed across a weather-beaten deck, let us remember, pirates, for all their danger and dirt, knew how to feast, and that, perhaps, is their truest treasure of all.